Over the last week, I wrote 27,000 words about the Tortured Poets Department. If you want to read those, you can go to the link in my bio. The whole review is there. All the breakdowns of all the songs, my final rankings of them all. I appreciate your patience. I don't think I could have gotten this out any sooner. This album needs at least a week of really looking at it closely to have solid, complex opinions about it. It's my strong opinion that the Tortured Poets Department is the most lyrically dense and thematically rich album in Taylor's entire catalog. Nearly every track is sewn into this vast Byzantine web of motifs and metaphors, interwoven in and around all the other songs on the record like this complex canopy of branches with roots that extend deep into her previous records as well. The more time I spent with this album, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh listen, I found myself uncovering melodies and sonic palettes from albums like Folklore and Evermore, and I increasingly began to notice symbols and analogies that weren't just recurring at different times in different places on this record, but which have been present all throughout Midnights as well. Over the last year or so that I've been obsessing over Taylor's whole body of work, I've watched her build her skill set over time, even putting aside the ways in which she's become a far superior live performer and has started to direct her own music videos and so on. Just in terms of her albums, her compositions, her production, her singing, her lyrics, every single record shows the lessons that she's learned and the talents that she's grown from the one before it. And each of them has felt like something of an exploration into uncharted lands, trying a new sound, trying a fresh aesthetic, carving a new facet into the complex gemstone that is her body of work to date. But this album stands apart from me in that rather than being yet another reinvention, another step into some new direction, Taylor has kind of reflected all of these facets inward like a prism, and in the center there's a reflection of all the skills that she's developed over the 16 years that she's been making this music. Blended elements of every style she's experimented with and a rainbow of musical and lyrical themes that can be traced back to each era of her catalog. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about her having done this is that it's still, despite what seems like it must have been this tediously calculated effort for someone whose catalog covers such a wide breadth of styles, it still somehow feels like the most organic, unforced, and honest record of her career. In Alchemy, there's this concept of the magnum opus, the process of transforming prima materia, that which encompasses and underlies everything, something that contains all colors and all materials, and condensing and purifying and extracting and distilling it until what you're left with is something magical and transcendental. And so for now at least, before the months and years have passed for us to look back on this album with wiser eyes than we have now, in the alchemical sense, this feels like Taylor's magnum opus. Not a newly discovered element, but a projection of many elements into something that has the qualities of all of them and is greater than the sum of its parts. And it's ironic that I should start this album off with such high praise like that for two reasons. The first is that one of the most prominent themes on this album is actually the tearing down of romanticized ideals. Taylor repeatedly describes the failures that follow romanticizing people and places and times, the shortcomings of memory and nostalgia, and the sorrow that accompanies escapist idealizing. And the theme of deromanticization extends to Taylor herself. Taylor has always openly shared her struggles and her failures, but never before has she pointed the spotlight so directly at the moments when she made those mistakes, never so explicitly laying bare all of her internal contradictions and her misguided ideas. And the other reason I think is ironic is that a reasonable person could fairly describe this as Taylor's worst pop record, and I can't really agree or disagree with that any more than I could agree or disagree with the claim that a cat is the worst dog. Because it's not a dog. In the sense that people have come to expect from the biggest pop stars, and to a lesser degree in the sense that people have come to expect from Taylor given the precedent that she set with her previous records to this point, this is not that kind of pop album. The ideal pop album to please the masses is 12 3.5-minute tracks, not too long to make anyone uncomfortable, never lingering on heavy ideas. Each track is a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, rap. Each hook is more memorable than the last, no challenging melodies, absolutely no dissonance. Each is a single serving tailored for radio spins and 10 years from now laundry detergent commercials. It's neat and lean and heavily edited and really sticky, and those can be great, but I don't think it should be a terribly controversial thing to say that Taylor and Jack Antonoff are more than capable of making a record like that. There might not be any two collaborators on the planet more capable of making a record like that, but that's not what they did here. That's not what this record was ever meant to be. I strongly suspect that in the grander conception of how this album functions as a piece of art, it has more in common with Blonde on Blonde or Tusk than it does with 1989 or even Folklore. Its length is not a failure of critical editing, it's a very conscious, deliberate artistic decision. The core theme of this album is not upbeat synth pop, it's not brooding electro pop, it's not mellow folk pop. The theme of this album is Taylor's lived experience for the past 2 years, manifested and realized in turn using whichever of the many pigments of her ever-growing palette best suited that song. The result is a tonally and lyrically kaleidoscopic record held together by only one thing, the signature brushstroke of Taylor herself. And so I do agree that it's far and away the Taylor album that is least suited for new fans, for the radio, for people unfamiliar with her work, but in the very same sense, it's the most astounding and beautiful and rewarding mosaic waiting at the end of the rainbow for the people who have walked each of the 10 paths that eventually wound their way here. Now, before I get into discussing each individual song, I want to establish two things. The first is that I will not be using the names of any specific individuals whom Taylor herself does not name in these songs. If you're looking for an analysis into that, there is plenty to be found on every corner of the internet, I assure you. But I want to offer a slightly different perspective here, and I hope you find that valuable. We don't need to pretend like we don't have a good idea who these songs are about. I just want to engage with the album as a work of art first and foremost, and as a piece of celebrity entertainment second. That being said, I will of course be discussing the major themes of this record, which in my view form a clear and largely chronological narrative that continues over from Midnight's and to a lesser degree reaches as far back as Red at times. And the most fundamental narrative here is one of a deep, long-standing relationship, one that's dominated the lyrics of each of Taylor's records since Reputation, and which we saw beginning to crack in places over her last few albums, especially on Midnight's. Having gone into listening to Midnight's with a mere fraction of the knowledge of Taylor's personal life that basically every other fan of hers had, from my very first listen to that record, I was finding things that strongly indicated to me that the relationship that Taylor had been describing for several albums now was in a difficult state. I refer back to my analysis of the Lavender Haze music video, as that was really the moment when it became an inescapable theme of the record for me. And then of course soon after Midnight's was released, we got some additional tracks like It's Different, and most significantly You're Losing Me, which really started to complete the picture that she'd started painting some time ago. And so with the Tortured Poets department, we pick up right where we left off. But from the beginning of this record, one would be forgiven for thinking that we hadn't, that we must have missed something. But trust me, come along for the ride, and we're going to walk through the plot lines of the longest and most complex story that Taylor has yet told. And that story begins with a prologue to the album, a bit of musicless poetry from Taylor, which I think does a really effective job at setting the stage for the story to come. She writes, "I had been struck with a case of restricted humanity, which explains my plea here today of temporary insanity. You see, the pendulum swings of the chaos it brings leads the caged beast to do the most curious things." So Taylor's informing us here in advance that as a result of something which had restricted her humanity, which is a really kind of potent, powerful phrase of pain and loss, she briefly lost her senses and swung in the opposite direction of where she had been, into chaos. And what was awaiting her in the new direction? What was the source of the pain and the loss? She says, "Lovers spend years denying what's ill-fated, resentment rotting away galaxies we created. Stars placed and glued meticulously by hand next to the ceiling fan, tried wishing on comets, tried dimming the shine, tried to orbit his planet. Some stars never align. And in one conversation, I tore down the whole sky." The slow rot and building resentment of this relationship that she had attempted desperately to keep alive, but which was fated to die. These metaphors will all return later. But for now, she tells us where the pendulum has taken her. Spring sprung forth with dazzling freedom hues, then a crash from the skylight bursting through. Something old, something hallowed, who told me he could be brand new. And so I was out of the oven and into the microwave, out of the slammer and into a tidal wave. So it's a microwave. She swung into a microwave. An old flame returned with promises of heating her up in just 45 seconds, never mind that it's going to be a little soggy on the outside and still frozen in the middle. Taylor's telling us here in advance that before she really had the chance to completely process the end of her long-term relationship, she erratically swung into an old resurrected one with incredible promises on offer. And what happens from there? How gallant to save the Empress from her gilded tower, swinging a sword he could barely lift. But loneliness struck at that fateful hour, low-hanging fruit on his wine-stained lips. He never even scratched the surface of me. None of them did. In summation, it was not a love affair, I screamed, while bringing my fist to the coffee ring desk. It was a mutual manic phase. It was self-harm. So it didn't go so well. In fact, it went so poorly in retrospect, it's less of a love affair and more of a manic act of self-harm done together with someone that didn't meet any measure of the knight that he had pretended to be. And then Taylor really makes it clear what we should expect from this album in the next few lines. It was house and then cardiac arrest. A smirk creeps onto this poet's face because it's the worst men that I write best. It was house arrest, the slow rotting away of a relationship that cannot be saved, followed by an erratic and brief heartbreak that failed on its promises. And then when the dust had settled from both of them, Taylor emerged coping with two losses simultaneously. The deep, deep wound that she'd been left with after the first relationship slowly and painfully fell beyond any hope of saving, and then the abrupt ripping off of the poultice that she'd manically placed atop it and the salt that was rubbed into the wound. The second relationship's pain was parasitic of the first. A wounded and vulnerable heart was offered fast-acting medicine, and it turned out to be poison, and she was left to heal from two injuries simultaneously. And her response is to smile, because as Taylor will explain to us, it's her prophetic curse in life to take heartbreak and turn it into beautiful poetry, and in so doing, liberating herself of that painful story by making it ours. So, let's talk about that story. The opening track on the album's lead single is Fortnight, featuring Post Malone, a track which serves as something of a prologue itself, like a musical prologue, before the chronology of the album really begins to take hold. It picks up right where Midnight's left off, with Hit's different metaphor of being taken away, of having lost her mind and needing to be involuntarily committed for her mental health. But as she speculates on Midnight's about them coming to take her away, here we discover that they never did. She was supposed to be sent away, she says, but they forgot to come and get me. And as a result, she's left to her own devices and whims and poor decisions of the temporary insanity that's befallen her. So much of what's to come on this record, especially these next 10 songs or so, is framed from these very first lines as having been theoretically avoidable if someone had just taken her away, if she'd just waited out the insanity in a padded cell or something. But they didn't. We also see one of the major lyrical themes of the record established here, which is the contrast of two very different people and two very different relationships that she had with them, with the references to buying the car you want. Compared Taylor's dismissals of all the boys and their expensive cars with their Range Rovers and their Jaguars on King of My Heart, to the cowboy like me, never wanted love, just a fancy car. And we get a sense of the contrast of the quiet, anti-materialistic romance with the fast-moving, fast-driving, fast-burning tryst. This theme, in a dozen different shapes and sizes, manifests again and again over the first half of this record, and she's setting it up for us right here. Unlike the songs to come on this record, though, this one doesn't strike me as being about like an actual lived experience, but more of an imagining of a future in the wake of all the experiences to come. Her long-term relationship had failed, her short-lived miracle move-on drug was a medicine worse than the disease, and now here she is, the version of herself who sat to write this all down, imagining a miserable and loveless future where she'll always be wondering, what if? And we'll have much more to say about being left always wondering later on the album as well. What exactly was the Fortnight? Which of the two relationships does it refer to? Is it playing off the 13 tracks on Midnight's? I kind of think asking that question of this song is a mistake. In contrast to the clear specificity of most of the later tracks, I think the important thing here is just how it lingers, how this love that seems short, now long since ended, still gnaws at her, still makes her restless, still leaves her resentful of her partner's wife and stuck in an inferior relationship with her new husband. The lover is gone, but the love and the pain are not. Musically, this one took me a few listens to really warm up to, but the more spins it gets, the more I like it. It's a really subtly sticky chorus, and though I think this album is full of incredibly catchy hooks, this is one of the very few choruses that feels traditionally poppy. That's to say, it's far from my favorite chorus, or song for that matter, but I do think it is a very good and appropriate choice for the lead single for the album. It's just dripping with Jack Antonoff's oddball production, with all these really weird, curious textures appearing for just a few seconds only to vanish and be replaced with some wholly new little sound that lasts just as briefly. It's certainly not lacking in layers to discover on repeated listens. It's also got a really soft and slow build from the super sparse opening to the massive, dense ending, and as I've said on my reviews of her last few albums, the recording quality and the mixing on Taylor's albums is just so good. I know it's polarizing, I know some people don't like every decision, but man, I just think it's just the best in all of pop music. This album on good, neutral balanced headphones sounds incredible, and Taylor's voice on this song, really every single one of these 31 tracks, is just gorgeous. She's developed such a distinctive voice, and her lower register has gotten so robust. I just adore it. And it's always just recorded and processed so tastefully and so well. I don't love every production decision on this album, but Taylor's vocals never fail to deliver here. And speaking of that, she's not the only voice on this song. Austin has a little bit of backing vocals that dance around on the track, but he really gets his moment to shine in the outro, where he shows up to deliver his lines with this whole different cadence to anything we'd heard before on the song. And it's very possibly my favorite part of this track. His long, lingering anti-penultimate syllables, move to Florida, by the car you want. It's just a really refreshing and surprising switch up that I think works really well. That said, I'm not entirely sure that Post is offering something on this track that couldn't have been done by basically anyone else. Like, don't get me wrong, I like Post Malone. I think he did a great job here. It's just not particularly posty, you know? I wouldn't say that he really lends a flavor to the track that's unique to him. But hey, he does a good job with it, so there's really nothing worth lingering on there. All things considered, it's got a catchy chorus, it's got sharp and interesting production. It's lyrically a little vague compared to the songs to come, but it's helping us establish the mindset from which this record was written. So yeah, really solid track. Not my favorite on the record, but I have very little to critique here. Next up is the title track and the first real introduction to one of the album's two primary plot lines, the aforementioned miracle move-on drug romance. So I want to start talking about this track by just going on a really brief tangent that I think might be informative for people who don't entirely know what she's getting at with some of the lines in the chorus here. But even for those who do, I promise I'm going somewhere with this. So Taylor has clearly read Patti Smith's autobiographical book, Just Kids. It's a book where Patti details her time living in New York with the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, and for a significant portion of the book they're staying at the Chelsea Hotel, which was kind of a late 60s, early 70s 70s mecca of artists and poets. And during her time there, Patty was just casually bumping into Andy Warhol or Salvador Dali or Allen Ginsberg, Lou Reed, right? Just these insanely famous and influential people who were all just haunting the same streets at that time. And for anyone who grew up idolizing people like Patty or Bob, as I did, I grew up listening to Horses and Highway 61 from as early as I can remember. The Village/Chelsea area of New York in the late 60s and early 70s has this unattainably magical quality to it. It was like the East Coast counterpart to the Bay Area Haight-Ashbury Summer of Love. The late 60s counterculture happening in those places had this influence on American art and culture that's so impossible to overstate that it's just become mythologized. And likewise, Dylan Thomas, the great Welsh poet, also stayed at the Chelsea Hotel years before Patty was there, and of course we're all familiar with Taylor's romanticizing of the great British poets from the lakes on folklore. And so all that's to say, we enter into one of the primary themes of this record, which is depicting something in a romanticized, idealized, mythological light, and then rejecting that interpretation of it. It's implied in the chorus of this song that Taylor's companion is the one doing the romanticizing of their status and their relationship as these two talented writers and artists having this out-of-time mythical existence together, and Taylor just does not take this comparison seriously. Not least of which because I'm sure they were staying somewhere far, far more luxurious than the then very cheap Chelsea Hotel was. So she mocks him for this idea, dismissing them as modern idiots, and rolls her eyes at his use of a typewriter, which is also a symbol of kind of a presumed artistic seriousness. But this isn't really mocking in a derogatory way. Like, Taylor affectionately asked, who's gonna troll you, if not her? And it's framed as something alluring, which is very interesting. Famous artists, as we must assume of the you in this track, are rarely prodded and picked on by people in their lives, and many people who are continuously met with praise have a special admiration and respect for the people who are less impressed by them, as they rarely feel themselves that the things they're doing are so impressive and praiseworthy. Taylor is the exceptionally rare individual who is more widely acclaimed than anyone she could possibly be with, and I get the impression here that she offers this alluringly unimpressed quality, as it seems like this kind of poking fun and trolling was a core dynamic of this relationship. It seems very playful in that way. It's fun. It's a stark contrast with the long, quiet, kind of heavy relationship we saw unfolding on most of Midnight's. And really, this whole song is a showcase of those contrasts and an introduction to all the intense traits of the new partner. He engages in self-sabotage, he's unhinged in public forums, he's written about in the media, he's tempestuous, he's unstable. They tell Taylor's friend that they'll kill themselves if Taylor ever leaves. We couldn't be farther from the kind of person that Taylor has described over her previous records. And that really hits its peak when, after many references across Taylor's last several albums to wanting to get married, this new person, who has presumably only been around for a very short while, performs kind of a faux proposal, placing a ring on her finger. Welcome to the microwave, folks. Pay no mind to the red flags behind the glass. Both lyrically and musically, there's a lot to like about this track. The writing style feels quite unusual for Taylor. The casual statement of seemingly incidental events, the way he eats the chocolate and talks about Charlie Puth, the blunt recounting of the conversations with Lucy and Jack, and the line tattooed golden retriever, all of that strikes me as something I'd be more likely to see in a Phoebe Bridgers song than a Taylor song. The music and vocal cadence has a real feeling of being carried away in a current. It's relentless. This smooth forward movement. I'm getting hints of like Paul Simon and like maybe even the Jesus and Mary chain in that opening percussion, but also some undeniable feelings of the 1989 vault tracks as well. Each of the three choruses on this song are quite different from one another, but especially that third one has a radically different vocal delivery and production style. Those twinkling high synths instantly reminded me of Is It Over Now in the best way. And once again, Taylor's voice is gorgeous on this whole song. For all the people who have had an issue with her swearing in the past, I mean, that's never been me, frankly, but it's never felt more natural than it does on this album. So hopefully this resolves some of those reservations for you. She's a grown woman, folks. It's time to get over it. This track's greatest merits for me, though, just kind of come from vibes. The choruses are catchy enough, the verse melody is really nice as well, but like those 1989 vault tracks, it's really the atmosphere created by the production that carries this track to its highest points for me. Track number 3 is My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys and serves as an introduction to the second major plotline on this record, the longer and the deeper of the two relationships, which is, at this point, beyond hope, either well into its final days or already formally concluded. On past songs, when Taylor has spoken about what seems to be this same relationship, she's repeatedly alluded to the struggle of being with someone who's suffering from depression and anxiety. On Peace, there's I'm a Fire and I'll Keep Your Brittle Heart Warm When Your Cascade Ocean Wave Blues Come. Hoax has Don't Want No Other Shade of Blue But You, No Other Sadness in the World Would Do. Renegade has Is It Really Your Anxiety That Stops You From Giving Me Everything, or Do You Just Not Want To? And we're going to see much more of that later on this record with tracks like So Long London and LOML. Here that theme reappears in the opening lines. Oh, here we go again, the voices in his head called the rain to end our days of wild. And so as we'll see over this record, the struggle of being with someone who has these really dark phases where they just kind of shut the world out is one of the overarching themes in the description of this relationship's deterioration. And I'm sure many people out there have experienced this. It's very difficult to be a good partner and build a strong relationship with someone who's suffering from depression or someone who shuts down and closes themselves off. Made all the more challenging by the fact that these things are often outside of that person's control and not something that you can blame them for or just demand them to fix. So these are grown-up, complex, adult relationship problems, not the chaotic explosion of a short-term love affair. She also describes herself as an army doll here, which harkens back to the song The Great War, as well as the line, "Fighting in only your army from your losing me." It's also possible that in referring to herself as a doll, Taylor is reframing the lover house as a dollhouse in which she existed. Once again, she contrasts her partner with the Kens as she did in Hits Different, and she refers to herself as his queen, which brings to mind the line, "I'm your American queen" on King of My Heart. So she's really laying the groundwork here to make it as clear as possible that we're in a different relationship here than we were on the previous track. This is a long and complex album, and Taylor makes really effective use of the prologue and these first two tracks to establish her central themes and the cast of characters. A couple other major themes of this album make their first appearance on this track as well. Fake smiles, facades of happiness, and living in denial. Here it's rivulets descend my plastic smile, and 2 is being caged and trapped by the world she exists in. In this case, he took me out of my box. Keep an eye out for both of those because they're woven all throughout this record. But one new wrinkle that we get in this song in particular comes in the second verse when she says, "There was a litany of reasons why we could have played for keeps this time. I know I'm just repeating myself. Put me back on my shelf. But first pull the string and I'll tell you that he runs because he loves me." So here Taylor strongly implies that this relationship has already failed more than once and has been repeatedly resuscitated, to the point where Taylor feels like she's developed this canned response to it, that she just finds herself saying the same thing to justify and excuse its failures. She really believed in it, really wanted to play for keeps this time, but was ultimately living in denial of the fact that it just wasn't working. And while she clearly doesn't perceive him as being faultless in this, she takes a lot of the blame when she says, "Once I fix me, he's gonna miss me," which also carries a connotation that fixing herself inherently entails him missing her and therefore her leaving the relationship. It's a realization that to grow and to heal, she just can't be here anymore. And yet at the end of the track, when he tells her she's better off without him, she says, "I'm not," and repeats it again, "I'm not." And that's kind of where our two plot lines converge and where the chronology of this album really begins. Taylor's going to tell us the story of what she did immediately following the end of this relationship. Instead of taking the time to herself to fully process it all, to heal from the pain, instead of checking herself into the asylum, we already know that she was offered a miracle move on drug, and we're about to learn why she was not better off that way. Musically, I don't love this track quite as much as the previous two. Mostly I'm just not totally in love with the hook and the chorus. It's fine, but I like the bridges and the outro melody a lot. That bit really elevates the song for me. Production-wise, it's also one of the less interesting tracks on the record as well. Across the board, I think the production on this album has some super high highs, but there are also a small handful of tracks that are just more passable, and this is one of the passable ones for me. It works, there's nothing objectionable about it, but nothing super exciting either. Once again though, my favorite part of this track are Taylor's vocals. I love how low she plunges for lines like "purchased at the mall." If you've ever read or watched any of my past reviews, you'll know I'm just the biggest sucker for her lower register. And there's also the really interesting, almost sultry delivery of "but first pull the string." I appreciate how the two verses here are sung in almost entirely different ways, which is another trend that carries on through this album. We've got a lot of super varied, unpredictable verses and choruses coming up. But yeah, overall, this is probably one of my 5 least favorite songs on the record, and maybe it'll tell you something about how I feel about this album, that I still don't really have all that much to critique about it, and I definitely think this is like a solid B-tier track and is absolutely not a skip. Track number 4 is "Down Bad," and here we see the first real crossing of the streams between the two plot lines of the two relationships and the ways in which they're inextricably linked. Although this is primarily a song about the short-term hot-burning relationship, it strikes me as likely intentional that the verses of this song are riddled with the word "you." Did you really beam me up? Did you take all of my old clothes? They'll say I'm nuts if I talk about the existence of you. But the choruses here are anchored on a repeated refrain of "fuck it if I can't have him." That might not be meaningful, but I'm really inclined to think that it is. The "you" of this song is framed as an extraterrestrial visitor, an alien on a spaceship that takes Taylor aboard only briefly, shows her incredible things, and then abandons her, leaving her feeling like it was all a big con, that she was just being used. And after it's over, she's got these really complex feelings about it. On one hand, she had this really amazing experience and she wants it back, she misses it, and she's frustrated that she can't even talk about it without people thinking she's insane. She says, "I'll build a fort on some other planet where they can all understand it." She's desperate for people to just know what she experienced, to get how she felt. But on the other hand, the abandonment just stings so badly. She says, "How dare you think it's romantic, leaving me safe and stranded?" Which is a callback to the New Romantics, "Please leave me safe and stranded." It's so romantic. There's a lot of grappling with internal contradictions and desires, as I said at the start of this review. The dismantling of romanticized ideals in actual practice. There also might be a little bit of a snow on the beach thing happening here. Go revisit the lyrics to that song and see if you think there's something there. I can't quite decide. But anyway, then there's the hymn of the chorus, the one whose absence means that everything comes out teenage petulance, which I take to be a reference to the older, longer relationship. Writing "I might just die, it would make no difference," contemplating just dying after the end of the relationship, is something that we're going to see multiple times throughout this album in definite reference to the older relationship. Looking at it this way depicts Taylor as someone who was already at her lowest point when someone came along and seemed like salvation, that offered her an escape from it all, and then just dumped her back on the ground even worse off than they found her. And that does feel like the dominant story beat of the first half of this record to me. And in the songs to come, Taylor's going to depict exactly what teenage petulance looked like and how it manifested. Putting the lyrics aside, the production and instrumentation on this track is just so fun. I love that weird trumpety synth noise that opens the track and peeks through a few times throughout. That's the kind of thing that Taylor simply never, ever would have had on any of her music pre-folklore. She's only really started to become comfortable with stuff that sounds that alien, pun intended, on Midnights. And I just think it's such a positive evolution in her willingness to stretch herself creatively and expand beyond the borders of traditional pop sounds. That sound, along with the bubbling dance of keys in the bridge, is really effective at creating this spacey, ethereal soundscape, so it's a perfect complement to the lyrical references to being beamed up and having close encounters. But the highlight of this track for me is Taylor's vocal cadence on the choruses. On this album, as was frequently the case with Midnights as well, the music serves as more of a backdrop and isn't typically where the song's main melody lies. Taylor's vocals carry the main melodies instead. And this track has easily one of my all-time favorite vocal cadences from Taylor, which, along with that clicking percussion behind it, has an almost like hip-hop feeling to it. These vocals are easily the catchiest melody on the album so far, and they've just been growing on me with every single listen. It's very possible that this is the most sing-alongable part of any track on the entire record, and I've had no success at trying to listen to it and not standing up and rolling my shoulders and singing along. And on top of that, the quality of her voice on the pre-chorus lines like "I was heaven-struck," or the bridges "How dare you say that it's," rival any of her most emotional line deliveries in her whole catalog. Ridiculously catchy vocal hooks, excellent vocal delivery, really fun and weird instrumentation, and while not my favorite lyrics on the record, definitely a song that I feel contributes to the overall story that's unfolding on the album. So, easily one of my favorite tracks. Alright, we're on to track 5, and before we even listen to the track, there's no mistaking which plot thread we're following here. The title is a clear reference to the London boy of lover, so we're turning the focus back onto the older relationship. And the use of the phrase "so long" evokes both a goodbye and a literal long period of time, something that she's going to play with in the lyrics here. The opening melody's call and response is just gorgeous and so different from anything she's ever done. It has this church-like energy, but also brought to mind like London bridges falling down with an almost like children's choir vibe. It's fascinating and it's beautiful, and it's immediately followed by more weird ethereal synths, and then Aaron's classic warm resonant production style. And then Taylor comes in with these rich, deep vocals, one of her most consistently low register songs of her whole catalog, and I just love it. Her voice is just so damn good on this song. And the lyrics here are among the most dense on the whole record as well. Allow me to indulge in this just for a moment, because there's just so many callbacks to metaphors and concepts that she's played with in the past when discussing the same relationship. Perhaps foremost among them is the reference to the color blue and the incredible line, "You sacrificed us to the gods of your bluest days." One of my favorite lines on the whole album, and it immediately brings to mind tracks like Peace, the Cascade Ocean Wave Blues, Paper Rings, I'm With You Even If It Makes Me Blue, and Hoax's Don't Want No Other Shade of Blue But You. And of course there's blue being symbolic of the blues of depression. We already talked back on My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys about the repeated references to being with someone suffering from depression on several tracks to date. And as I said about that song, the blues seem to be accompanied with a shutting down and a closing off, which here takes the form of "Stop trying to make him laugh, stop trying to drill the safe." And we also get the line "I died on the altar," which brings to mind champagne problems and "You're losing me." But here the wedding altar takes a second meaning as a sacrificial altar, where she's killed to the aforementioned gods of his bluest days. And there are just so many more. There's Hampstead Heath from London Boy, there's the absence of sufficient love from High Infidelity, there's the CPR line that brings to mind "You're losing me again," as well as the Stitches Undone, which calls back to champagne problems and Cardigan and most explicitly Glitch. There's the Moment of Warm Sun that calls back to Daylight and Fresh Out the Slammer later on this record. There's yet another reference to Taylor feeling like she gave away her youth on one of the song's most biting lines. There are just so many of these. This song is made of the pieces of at least half of the songs she's written about this relationship. It's remarkable. And the lyrics are just composed in a really interesting way as well. I love how she plays with the phrase "so long" and the way the verses lead into the different meanings of those words as each chorus begins. It's just so clever and so thoughtful. This is one of the most impressive bits of lyricism in her whole catalog. And once again, I can't overstate how much I love her vocals. The delivery on the bridge here is immaculate. That backing vocal layer and how dark the tone of the whole song turns, it just feels so ominous and heavy, and Taylor's got this desperate anger in her voice, only for nearly all of that building, swelling intensity to disappear for the first lines of the final verse. Her vocal tone on this whole song is just stunning. The frustration you can hear in the words, all that youth for free, oh my god. I was enjoying this album a lot already, but the 1-2 punch of an incredible pop track followed by one of the hardest hitting ballads of her career on tracks 4 and 5 here is when I really got locked into this record. So the alternating pattern and plotline focus continues here, and we return to the new short-lived alien abduction relationship on one of Taylor's most sharp-tongued and snarky songs since Blank Space, But Daddy I Love Him. This song is simultaneously so playful and so funny, and also so intense and so aggressive. It's just an absolute trip. There have been few songs in Taylor's whole catalog that hit me so hard on the very first listen. For anyone who's read or watched my videography deep dive, I've talked extensively about Taylor's early career branding as barefoot girl in a flowy dress, and she effectively puts that outfit back on for this track. She's wearing the debut Fearless era Taylor costume, using horse metaphors, calling herself a simple girl, and even resurrecting a very subtle version of her country-tinged accent in moments like when she sings True Love. She's the dutiful daughter with the woven braid, the choice of the word daddy. It's all backed with this very gentle little plucked acoustic guitar that conjures up her early records. There's even a fiddle buried in the mix there. When's the last time Taylor's used a fiddle? So you remember the teenage petulance? Here it comes. Because of course she's putting on this costume sarcastically. She's saying, oh, am I just a simple little good girl who needs to be saved? Is that who you think I am? The teenager who wrote Love Story? That's still me? And she turns around and breaks the facade and just says, hey, no, I'm not, and how about you back the fuck up? So there was considerable public and media backlash in response to Taylor's short-lived relationship, and she has some things to say about that. She also appreciates that a significant amount of her fans and a lot of the media attention that she's gotten over the years have had to do with her relationships. She's keenly aware of how the West was won, but she's second-guessing whether it was ever fun for people to be invested in her relationships like this, because it feels now more like a cage than ever before. So she pulls out these Old Testament names like Sarah and Hannah and frames them as these church-going wine moms clutching their pearls in horror at how Taylor Swift, the adult, grown-ass, intelligent, powerful woman, could dare tarnish the reputation of Taylor Swift, the teenage good girl that they have permanently decided that she must be. You ain't gotta pray for me, she says. This rebuke of like a holier-than-thou attitude, especially with the veneer of moral Christianity, is gonna come up multiple times on this record. Paraphrase her in her documentary, judging her life is not Tennessee Christian values. This track's also giving shades of like Madonna's Papa Don't Preach in that way, and I should be clear that I don't think this song is 100% directed at her fans, and I certainly don't think it's directed at 100% of her fans. I actually think it's a pretty small and specific group of people that she's biting back at here. But nevertheless, the fact that she's biting back at all is admittedly pretty surprising. But I myself am going to be called out later in this album for thinking that she wouldn't do it, that she was muzzled. And I'm just proud of her for it, you know? Good for Taylor, man. Regardless of how anyone feels about any decision that she's made, thinking you know better than she does about what's best for her life is just keep it to yourself, you know? Keep it to yourself. I think the way she played with the contrast of her early career imagery with the intensity of the bridge here is just so clever. She couches that big punch that she threw in exactly the kind of song and sonic palette the people she's biting back at are wanting more of and still think she is, the country pop Taylor. It's like hiding a pill inside a tree to get your dog to take their medicine. And then doubling down with the I'm having his baby, no I'm not, but you should see your faces. Very possibly the funniest thing Taylor has ever put into a song. That line is so fucking good. And besides the main theme of this track, we still get little tie-ins to others on the album as well, with references to destiny and fate that are going to be cropping up multiple times. Bedroom Eyes Like a Remedy, which once again frames this relationship as like a miracle drug. And then Screeching Tires and True Love. There are plenty of references to reckless driving coming up. But perhaps my favorite, the line, If all you want is gray for me. We're going to see gray referenced quite a bit throughout this album as well, and the album covers themselves are largely gray. So I think it's very intentional, and we'll get into that later. But yeah, super classic sound. Both the verse and chorus melodies feel like they could have been on Fearless, with subtle shades of like early 2000s pop country all over this song. And Taylor puts a gun to her empire and says she'll burn this entire thing to the ground. I love that. Those beautiful backing vocals at the end, he was chaos, he was revelry. What more can you ask for? It's a great, fun, wild, wholly unexpected track. Track number 7, Fresh Out the Slammer, opens with what sounds almost like an Ennio Morricone soundtrack. We've carried over some of these country vibes from the last track into a more adult, dark, outlaw country energy here. We've grown up, and it's clear from the start here, the prologue gave us a little hint as well, that the slammer that's being left behind is her long-term relationship. She's out of Ready for It's jail, she's left Bejeweled's basement, and when she thinks back on it, she recalls silent dinners bitter and locks in ceilings, which again bring to mind someone who was closed off and impenetrable. The safe that she was done trying to drill through, and lavender hazes staring at the ceiling with you. You don't really say too much. And we get another reference to blue, now mixed with gray, and feeling handcuffed for just 1 hour of sunshine, which seems to refer back to daylight like So Long London did. But now Taylor's out. She's free. She's tossed the ashes off the ledge, which is another interesting metaphor that we've seen from her several times now. You're losing me has rising from the ashes. Bigger than the whole sky has every single thing to come has turned to ashes. Hoax has I am ash from your fire. And I can't help but think about the Lover House burning down in the Aristor graphics. The relationship and the prospective life that it implied have turned to ashes. But she's tossing them off the ledge, because in the second verse, she's found someone who's keeping her going and whom she swirled into all of her poems, which is these songs. And she's confident at this point in the story that this relationship is not going to fail as others have. She's learned her lessons. I've seen a surprising number of people say that this album lacks a clear through line, and at this point I hope you understand why I just don't. I don't get that at all. The story here has been very consistent, and this song just solidifies it perhaps more than any other. The bridge/outro here is really interesting though, and I think it could be interpreted in a variety of ways, and I actually prefer personally leaving it somewhat opaque. I think based on what lyrics we've already seen about both relationships, and based on the lyrics still to come on this album, this might be an example of Taylor's poems being swirled, as both relationships are kind of tangled together through this song. Imaginary Rings, for example, calls back to both Cardigan and the title track here, which are definitely about different relationships. I like it that way though, although I'm sure many people feel strongly that it's one or the other, and that's fine. This song also has some really gorgeous instrumentation. I love those big sizzling cymbals that remind me of the Rolling Stones' Moonlight Mile, and I love how you can hear the little finger slides on the acoustic guitar strings. And man, once again, unsurprisingly, Taylor's vocals are just so good. I love the contrast of her deep verse vocals and her high soaring chorus singing, and her vocal cadence is once again driving the melody of the song, and it works so well to that effect. The rhyme scheme and the vowel alliteration in the verses here is like MF Doom type stuff. Like, look at this. This song might not have any really big hitting lines or be like super lyrically dense, but I just love how she wrote the lyrics on this song. It really does feel almost more like hip hop writing than traditional Taylor lyricism. And then there's a really interesting shift in the melody and vocal delivery for the bridge/outro as well. That last line in particular is delivered in such a strange way, kind of pushing all the syllables together in a way that I've only ever heard once before on Bob Dylan's Murder Most Foul, and I have to wonder if that's intentional, because it's just such a unique sound. At any rate, yet another really solid track across the board. It doesn't hit highs quite as high as the previous three did, but still, what do I critique about this? What complaints are there? It does everything well. Next up is Florida, featuring Florence and the Machine, and let me just start this by saying that there have probably been less than 5 songs in Taylor's entire catalog that feel like they're even in the same ballpark as this one in terms of creative ambition. The harmonies and the dissonance, the shouting, the percussion, the production, the vocal delivery. It's like the pop antithesis of Closure in the best possible way. And much like I think Closure is one of her very best songs, and a lot of people really bounce off it, I imagine that this is going to be a pretty polarizing track as well. But if it works for you, if it clicks, just like Closure, it just slaps. Before I get into the lyrics here, let's establish what Florida is. Florida is 2 very important things. It's warm and sunny with tropical beaches and getaway resorts, and it's also a trashy, unhinged, overly humid marshland and a politically disgraceful cesspit. Both of those qualities are essential to this song. Florida is very appealing, and people flock there for suntan vacations to escape, to get away from it all, but nobody wants to actually live there. There are too many Florida man stories in the news for anybody to want to settle down and raise a family in that place. And I apologize if you live in Florida and love it. It's just it's the reputation. This alluring escapist veneer atop something that's already rotten inside is a perfect metaphor for the short-term relationship that Taylor's describing across this album. Florida is a drug just like the relationship is a drug. It was not a love affair, she wrote in the prologue. It was a mutual manic phase. It was self-harm. That's Florida. It's a big, coping, intoxicating cyclone. This track also picks up right where we left off with the themes of the previous 2 tracks, framing her from the opening lines as a criminal escaping jail and as someone who's being publicly persecuted for her decisions. Taylor says her friends all smell like weed or little babies, which is one of the most relatable lyrics she's ever written, from my perspective at least, and she's got to get the hell away from it all. And so she escapes into a little world, a new place, a new relationship where none of it can reach her, where no one will ask her any questions. And that's when the most wild and unexpected chorus she's ever released comes in swing. Just 13 words and even fewer than 13 seconds long. It's just this explosion of percussion and shouting and whispering all at the same time. It's so new and so different and so original, and I just think it's one of the most refreshing and exciting things on the whole album. And it flies by just in time for Florence Welch to come in with her impossibly gorgeous, otherworldly vocals. She's possibly the best voice in all of popular music in my book, and she just crushes it. I don't have a word that sufficiently conveys my feeling about how much she just devours her verse. I love the lyrics of her verse as well. The line, "Me and my ghost, we had a hell of a time," the callback to "No body, no crime," the line, "All of the bodies that have ever been on my body," but it's really just the way she sings it that's just so gorgeous and evocative. And Taylor's vocals on this song are amazing too. Every time she goes way up high for "Can I use you up" or "Go on, fuck me up," my whole body just lifts 3 inches off the ground. And yet none of that is even my favorite part of this song, because I'm going to stake my name on what might be a bit of a hot take here when I say that this is easily one of the top 10 bridges in Taylor's entire catalog. The trading of lines between Taylor and Florence, the building intensity, it's just pure magic. It's magic. I can't justify with words why I think it's so good. It's just lightning in a bottle. They just found some perfect balance of production and delivery and lyrics and so many layers of backing vocals, and there's just this energy that creates a swell that's as big as any swell I've ever heard in pop music. I'm head over heels in love with the bridge on this song, and just across the board, easily one of my favorite songs across the whole album, one of my favorite songs in Taylor's catalog. From excellent lyrics like "You work your life away just to pay for a timeshare down in Destin," which is one of the most Dylan-y things she's ever written, to Florence's beautiful collaboration, to the shocking chorus, to one of the greatest bridges I've ever heard, this song has everything. And I already know that "Fuck Me Up Florida" is going to be sold on t-shirts and captioned on Instagram and TikTok and shouted out of open-top rental cars on spring break for like the next 10 years. So it's going to leave a cultural legacy in its wake, on top of everything else. What more could you want? Track number 9 is "Guilty as Sin?" and it opens with a reference to the song "Downtown Lights" by the Blue Nile. For anyone who hasn't heard it, if you're into like mellow, groovy 80s synth music, you should absolutely go listen to that song, or at least check out Annie Lennox's excellent cover of it. And if it sounds familiar at all to you, that's because the backbone beat of that track was sampled in the 1975's "Love It If We Made It," which is actually how I discovered the 1975 a few years ago. So, you know, for the people who are primarily focused on paternity testing each one of these songs, there's that piece of information for you. But more interestingly, there are just a lot of lyrical and musical similarities between Downtown Lights and this one, so I think it's worth listening to no matter what. So we're very much still in the short-term relationship plotline here, deep into it now, and once again we get a track with some really dense lyricism and many callbacks to previous songs and metaphors, so indulge me one more time here. Taylor describes herself as being in a cage again. See, "This Is Me Trying," "Midnight Rain," "But Daddy I Love Him," "Who's Afraid of Little Old Me," "Cracking Locks," "Drilling the Safe in So Long London," "The Hedge Maze in Her Mind," "Labyrinth." There's also the really interesting lyric, "Am I bad or mad or wise?" which brings to mind "I Did Something Bad," "Mad Woman," and "Mastermind," and "Long-suffering propriety is what they want from me" is clearly a reference back to the people she's speaking to in "But Daddy I Love Him." And Taylor again conflates sexuality and religion as she did on "False God" when she asks, "What if the way you hold me is actually what's holy?" And then there's that line about having written "mine" on her upper thigh only in her mind, which strikes me as a double entendre easily interpreted as explicitly sexual, as described in the second verse, "Fatal fantasies, labored breath, we've already done it in my head," and the second chorus is "Bed sheets are ablazed, I've screamed his name," which also matches the Wildest Dreams Eras Tour visuals, interestingly. But just the same, it also conjures images of a wedding garter, which is also in the second verse, "A vow will uphold somehow." In either case, however you interpret it, it never came to pass, as she says she never touched his skin and the promise of marriage was counterfeit. There's also this apparent decision she's stuck between throwing her life to the wolves or the ocean rocks, which seems to be posing the question of whether she accepts the public scrutiny and the backlash of her new relationship, the wolves, or the desire to just die that she's repeatedly referenced in relation to the end of her old relationship. "Am I allowed to cry?" she asks with like a heartbroken sarcasm, whether she's allowed to be upset about the struggles in her new relationship, given that it seems like so many people are rooting for it to fail. "They're gonna crucify me anyway," she says, and she's right. In spite of all of that, the line that I really can't get out of my mind is, "I keep these longings locked in lowercase inside a vault," which does seem to imply that the feelings being described on this song have been with her since writing Folklore and Evermore, her albums in which everything is written in lowercase, and that she's never released those songs, and are thus in the vault, the same place that her unreleased tracks from her re-records are located. That's very interesting. I don't want to rehash all of Folklore and Evermore looking for threads to pull, but if you wanted to fall down that rabbit hole, I suspect there'd be a lot of space to do so. This song is built on just such a sexy, sensual groove, and a lot of the lyrics explicitly relate to lust and even masturbation. "False God" is the only other song in her catalog that feels like it even approaches this level of explicit sexuality, and only barely. And the instrumentation just really complements that super well. I love that slide guitar in the choruses, and this song also, despite falling somewhere in the middle of the pack overall on the album for me, has one of my absolute favorite moments on the record. After that bridge ends and everything goes quiet, the way the first line of the final chorus is shouted, and then that big muted drum roll comes in to send the song soaring back up to where it was, is just so well done, and it's just packed with so much power and intensity, and easily the highlight moment of the track for me. So coming into track 10, Who's Afraid of Little of Me, we have to talk about Taylor and witches. Taylor's depicted herself with witch-like qualities since I Did Something Bad, it reappeared on Mad Woman, and she clearly was intending to conjure up kind of a witch's coven with the Willow choreography on the Eras tour. This song frames her as being cornered, threatened with death, and put upon the gallows, and yet again, for not the first time in her career, Taylor is being persecuted for something she believes to be unfounded and unjustified, and also inextricably connected to misogyny. And yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Again, whether you agree with every decision Taylor has made in her life or not, the way she's been framed by the media and public as being disgraceful or wicked or unhinged are all rooted in fundamentally sexist bias against adult women making independent decisions. For example, like the title track, we get a reference to Taylor being told to keep her good name, something which she clearly finds to be an offensive assertion. And we're going to get more witch metaphors on later songs on this album as well. But for now, Taylor is at the public trial for her new relationship, and among those in the crowd attacking her are the very people who are walking the trails that she blazed. But Taylor here leaps from the gallows and levitates away, which the imagery of that is just so good. Like every single time I hear that chorus, I'm picturing it clearly in my mind. It's such a potent visual. Is no one afraid of her? Do they think they can just hang her and be done with it? Do they think she can't fight back? Do they think the circus life, the same one that she describes in Mirrorball, has taken out all her teeth? Do they think they can keep poking the caged bear and her claws won't come out? Well, if they do, they have made a grievous mistake. Taylor is not playing around. You're not afraid? You should be. She's owning her power, and frankly, it's no exaggeration to say that she possibly has the most soft power of any person in the United States. Second maybe to the Pope in the world. So when she says she's going to use her power, she's got plenty of it to use. She does have teeth. She can bite back, and we've already seen her do it once on this album. And then we get the most sheer anger Taylor has ever expressed on any song in her entire catalog on the bridge here. I know I already said Florida has one of the 10 best bridges in her catalog, but we get another one just 2 tracks later that I think is also a top 10 bridge. The giant rattling bass that comes along with the opening lines. They said they didn't do it to hurt me, but what if they did? Boom, boom, boom. I've described Taylor's vocal delivery as snarling in the past, but usually that's on like 1 or 2 words. She's just absolutely seething out these lines. She's spitting pure venom as she says, so all you kids can sneak into my house with all the cobwebs. I'm always drunk on my own tears. Isn't that what they all said? It's one of the most unabashed and unfiltered and raw things we've ever heard from Taylor on a song, and I just love it. And then the bridge gets even better when all this massive intensity and anger all turns to this very strange melancholy with the line that I'll sue you if you step on my lawn. This bridge brings to mind the gigantic Taylor from the Antihero video, too big and powerful to hang out, but now that her eyes have stopped glowing red, we see that she's just sad about it. She's angered and disgusted by the things that people have said about her, but she's also just, they hurt her, you know? She might be able to take on the persona of this vast, powerful witch who gets her vengeance, but Taylor is also the same person who, in her own words, is just too soft for all of it. And the way she sings the words lawn and along is just so beautiful and conveys such a complicated emotion. She's continuing to play this role while just not really believing in it herself anymore. And that she managed to convey all of that in one bridge is just unbelievable. This bridge is my entire world. This is yet another one of the very best songs on the record in my book, in case you couldn't tell. If I had anything to critique about this at all, I would just say that it gets so powerful and intense towards the end that the production on the first half of it kind of feels a little bit sparse in comparison. And one could also critique that it's wearing its inspiration on its sleeve with Lana Del Rey's Blue Jeans, which has a very similar sonic palette, including that twanging guitar and a pretty similar vocal cadence at the start as well. But I love Blue Jeans. It's one of my favorite Lana songs, so I'm not really complaining. I love this track. Track 11 is I Can Fix Him, No Really I Can. And you'd be forgiven, I suppose, for forgetting that there are 2 distinct relationship plot lines on this record, because we're on about 4.5 songs now dealing with the new relationship. But just hang on tight, because this one is about to do something very important for that storyline in that regard. So I Can Fix Him is the second track so far that has a sort of country western aesthetic to it after Fresh Out the Slammer. And you could also relate it back to the pop country But Daddy I Love Him as well, which creates this kind of common musical motif for the songs about this new relationship as having this country bent to them. This one conjures up a kind of Bonnie and Clyde vibes, with little hints of vigilante shit, Cowboy Like Me, and what feels like a very clear allusion to Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time in the bridge. But most strongly, this track resembles No Body, No Crime. I definitely suspect that the people who really love that song are also going to really love this one. But personally, No Body, No Crime is probably my least favorite song on either Folklore or Evermore. And likewise, the vibes here are good. Both songs are good, but just not exactly my favorite on the record. But boy, there's still so much to like about this track. To dive deep into the lyrics here for a moment, we've got the smoke cloud billows out of his mouth, which brings to mind daylight's contrasting, clearing the air by breathing in the smoke. And there are 2 more references to this to come on Clara Bow and Black Dog. prologue. We'll get to those soon. We've got another reference to dangerous driving. We've got more condemnation of the holier-than-thou judgmentalism in "But your good Lord doesn't need to lift a finger." Taylor also makes another reference to the temptation of heaven here, which we saw back on Down Bad, and which will come back around in LOML. And her assertion that she's able to handle a dangerous man is a much older and deeper reference, not just in Daddy I Love Him, but reaching back into Blank Space, a song whose echoes reverberate throughout the front half of this record. Taylor again frames herself as being capable of saving bad boys, and like both of those previous two tracks, it's not written with total sincerity. Each of these three songs takes a slightly different angle on why we aren't totally meant to believe that it's true, and here it's portrayed with such an over-the-top certainty. Taylor watching this guy wielding his guitar like a love-making pistol, chain-smoking cigarettes, and she's thinking, a perfect case for Dr. Taylor Allison Swift, fixer of men MD. It's clear to us from the start that the version of her writing this song no longer agrees. Saying "good boy, that's right, come close" is her playing with the dangerous animal in the same way that she warned others not to do with herself. It's really good, and it's really clever. And we also get a development of the plotline here, of the cracks appearing in the new relationship. In the midst of her overconfidence, she hears her new partner telling jokes across the bar that were revolting and far too loud. And the track ends with something of a plot twist, though at the same time something that had been foreshadowed from the beginning, where she says, "Whoa, maybe I can't." I really appreciate the honesty of this song, of Taylor's willingness to depict herself making a mistake, of confidently asserting something that later on in the very same song she goes back on. And the collapse of this new relationship, Taylor's abrupt realization that she cannot actually sculpt a halo out of already hardened clay, leads us back to the heartbreak that's at the core of this record, of grappling with the failure of two relationships simultaneously, of the get love quick drug wearing off after just the briefest moment and leaving her to deal with the pain of not just the new relationship, but the one that she was trying to run away from as well. Musically, as I said, I'm not totally in love with that No Body, No Crime vibe, but I do think it's super effectively executed. That lap steel guitar, the little clinks and clatters that convey kind of the Roadhouse bar setting, and the song really thrives with headphones on. The stereo mixing is really fun. All the instruments are coming from different angles. But once again, sorry to repeat myself, the highlight for me has got to be some of those low notes from Taylor. The line "traces hearts on my face." The face might be the single lowest note we've ever heard Taylor hit on any song. Could you even begin to imagine her hitting a note like that a few years ago? She really found a whole new dimension of her voice, and she's exploring it more on this album than she ever has before, and I'm absolutely here for it. So yeah, this might not be my favorite track on the album, but that really feels like a personal taste and aesthetic preference thing. I have no doubt that a lot of people are going to really love this track, and I can totally understand why. Okay, so we've spent several songs in a row now fully exploring the new relationship, the one that was intended to bandage over and disguise the pain of the unceremonious and slow dissolving of her years-long relationship. And finally, the illusion cracked. And Taylor is left on song 12, LOML, picking up the pieces of it all and confronting the loss that she tried to bury. This is yet another song with a ton of lyrical threads all knotted throughout it, so let's look at some of them just in the first verse alone. The song opens with a reference to waltzing back into rekindled flames, and we've got another misaligned dancing metaphor about this relationship to come later on the album, but it's also no surprise that we begin here with a callback to the album where this relationship first appeared, Reputation, on Dancing with Our Hands Tied. The Stitch metaphor returns here as well, recalling So Long London and Glitch, and Just Kids Babe probably refers back to the title track in Patti Smith's book. And the Better Safe Than Starry-Eyed refers to a metaphor in High Infidelity, and Cowboy Like Me, which will come back around on track 14 on this album, where a reference to a suit also returns again. And that's just in the first verse. And the song continues with so many more. Talking rings and talking cradles echoes that repeated theme of desiring marriage and children, that promise fading from her first relationship only to be falsely reignited in her short-lived second one. Referring to the relationship as something buried in a cemetery ties back to So Long London's Two Graves, One Gun. The Impressionist paintings of heaven conjure up pieces of dreamscapes on the wall. The arson's match ties back to the many references to ashes from the end of the relationship and the burning of the lover house. And the lyrical threads throughout this album, reaching into her last few projects, are just beyond counting. I could just sit here doing this all day. I've excluded like a dozen already just for brevity and your sanity. But like So Long London played with the double meaning of so long, perhaps my favorite lyrical feature of this track is the triple meaning of LOML. It transitions from the love of your life to the loss of my life. And it's not merely that the relationship, that her partner was the loss of her life, it's that her life itself is lost. In the arson's match and in his somber eyes, she ends the track by beholding the loss of her life, of the life that they had been building and the life that they might have had, the field of dreams that she'd envisioned and that he'd painted on the wall, that they'd embroidered together in the years that they spent with one another. It's just beautiful and it's devastating, and it's also no surprise to say that Taylor's vocals just elevate the lyrics even further. The delivery of the line "about a million times," which harkens back to illicit affairs, they lie and they lie a million little times, is just gut-wrenching. I'm not sure I've heard any line of a song Taylor's or anyone else's, delivered with such a kicked puppy, head down, heart torn out delivery. It's not dramatically sad, it's disappointedly sad. It's one of the most emotional single line deliveries in her whole career. Musically, I can't help but feel like this track was written in a way that consciously resembles Whitehorse, a song about having dreams before you were let down in a relationship and now it's gone and beyond saving. The first two choruses very strongly remind me of that track, whereas the third chorus comes around with a really unique transformation and this massive reverberating bass that saturates the whole mix and gives the track this new sonic weight that matches the increasing heaviness of the lyrics. It's another song that I wouldn't call one of my favorites on the album, but one can't help but marvel at the density of the lyrical and even musical connections here. It's the kind of song that, as I said about the record itself at the beginning, is just so rewarding and powerful for the people who are already familiar with her whole canon and understand the myriad ways in which this song reflects other songs about the same relationship. The depth and complexity on show here is something that only works because of how much groundwork she's laid for it, and I admire and am blown away by how much she managed to include without it ever feeling remotely forced or artificial. This seemingly incredibly organic breakup ballad is holding countless invisible strings tied to her past work. Recall the prologue of this album where Taylor, in response to all the heartbreak that she describes, says a smirk creeps onto this poet's face. LOML is the soft conclusion of a 12-track chronology of two intertwined heartbreaks, the loss of her life and the implosion of the relationship that she ran into after it ended. We're definitely not done with those stories yet, far from it, but for a moment, fittingly on track 13, we turn more to Taylor's specific life as it exists apart from her relationships with I Can Do It With a Broken Heart. Taylor's going through all this incredible internal emotional pain, the public scrutiny, the deception, feeling like she needs to be institutionalized, buying into a con man's schemes, all of this, and she's simultaneously entering into the biggest tour of her career and of all time, where she needs to go up on stage every night in front of 60, 70, 80,000 people and smile and dance and sing the happy songs that she wrote about this relationship when it was in its prime, and heart-wrenching songs about when it was starting to fall apart. She needs to relive this night after night in front of millions of people all around the world. I know she's Taylor Swift, and I know it's easy to think of her as something transcendental, not just a normal person. I know it's also easy to point out all of the incredible comforts and privileges that she has in her life, and I know that she herself has repeatedly said that she accepts the discomforts and the lack of privacy that come with her life because it's a trade-off that she accepted. It's the life that she wanted. But as someone who's been married for 10 years, I would implore anyone reading this who has been in a long-term relationship to just briefly imagine if your relationship ended and then you had to go sing and dance about it in public over and over and not look like you were about to crumble into a ball and die while you were doing it. It's just an insane thing for any human being to do, and my empathy for it is stronger than any of those qualifications that I've mentioned. I truly just can't imagine what that must be like. But Taylor goes up there, and in the midst of the crowd chanting more under the lights, smiling for the camera, she's internally thinking about the feelings in the previous song. He said he'd love me all his life. And she reframes the struggle as like a test that she has to pass. Tells herself she's a real tough kid, calling back to you're on your own kid. Inside, the pieces of her are shattering like a broken mirror ball. It's such an intense and potent contrast, and a song like this is just so smart. She could have done an uplifting song or two about the Eras Tour experience and just packaged them like that, but instead she wove the Eras Tour into the experience of the breakups because that's really what the lived experience was like for her. And the fact that she pulled it off, that this song works as well as it does, is just bananas to me. The use of the 1, 2, 3, 4 shouting like a choreo director calling out cues, the crowd vocals on more, and the way she sings the chorus with this smiling behind gritted teeth energy are just so cleverly done. I've seen many people respond to this song with a screenshot of the Barbie movie where Margot Robbie's dancing with a big smile on her face and asked, do you guys ever think about dying? And that feels like the energy of the chorus here in a nutshell. Her vocal talent is also fully showcased here, and how obviously fake and forced the smile feels, and how you can literally hear the smile and the subtleties of her enunciation. I wouldn't say there's a ton of deep analysis to be done on this song. It does, in my opinion, make clear references to both of the relationships from which she was recovering, but it really only has one main point to drive home, and does that with pretty obvious and terrific effect. That synth riff in the background of the chorus and scattered a bit throughout the rest of the song feels like it might be another musical callback as well, this time to Mastermind, which has a kind of rounder, softer version of a very similar melody behind it. Here it's honed to kind of a sharper, staticky edge. And the disintegration of the song at the very end, the way her words fall out of time with the music and she just laughs, shouts that she's miserable and try to come for my job, is the icing on the cake. Taylor is very aware that what she's doing is impressive, but she's not even really boasting about it. It doesn't come off as healthy. It comes off as someone who is pushing down their own emotions to do the work that they have to do, which makes it strangely relatable. As much as the specifics of this are so alien to nearly anyone else's life, she's not only blended the heartbreak of this album with the joy and excitement of the Eras Tour, she's managed to make it a song that most people, especially women who are much more socially compelled to repress their emotions and be performative in public and in their jobs, can connect with and say, I do this shit all the time too. It's a triumph. We're not done talking about the relationships though, because on track 14, The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, Taylor has one parting message for the con man partner who sold her the fraudulent remedy, and the result is the most scathing diss track that Taylor has ever penned. Dear John is pretty ruthless, but this one is just vicious, and remarkably, it feels like Taylor is even pulling some of her punches here in spite of how many she throws. The song opens with a deep sigh, so you already know we're in for some sadness, and the song does start off, for the first 2 verses and choruses, predominantly just really sad. We've got that starry-eyed and Jehovah's Witness suit references that were previously mentioned on loml to kind of set the scene here, but Taylor then dives right into a story about this man trying to buy pills off a friend of hers, and they refuse to sell them to him. So there is this recurring theme in the relationship, starting with the title track, and then repeating here with the second verses Stoned Oblivion. But can you imagine the person who got that message? Hey, someone tell Taylor this guy's trying to buy Percocet off me. Tell her it's her call whether I sell it or not. What a world. And Taylor asks in the choruses whether rusting her sparkling summer was his goal, referring back to the previous track and the way the Eras tour was tarnished by the heartbreak she was being put through. But then the sadness kind of takes a turn after the second chorus ends, and Taylor just goes off. Recall how on Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, I said that song had the most anger in Taylor's voice on any song in her career to this point? She's about to blow that completely out of the water. The bridge on this song, between the lyrics, Taylor's voice, and the incredible rock-inspired instrumentation that just comes in guns blazing, goes so hard. You can't sing along to this bridge and not just find yourself scowling the entire time. She throws these accusations and questions at him, interrogating him on why he would do what he did to her, whether this was all part of some covert operation to destroy her as precisely as possible, targeting her at her most vulnerable time, hitting every weak spot she had, only to stomp on her heart at the end of it. Several of the lyrics here also tie back to previous and upcoming songs as well. There's another reference to this person in Reckless Driving on But Daddy I Love Him, and the upcoming track I'm Gonna Get You Back. It wasn't sexy once it wasn't forbidden, which brings to mind Guilty as Sin, and perhaps illicit affairs and high infidelity, but I won't go too far down that path. You are what you did, interestingly, contrasts with Innocence. Who you are is not what you did. And I'll forget you, but I'll never forgive, contrasts with Bad Bloods. You forgive, you forget, but you never let it go. But the line that really stands out the most for me here is, and you deserve prison, but you won't get time. That's such an intense thing to say. It's not even really framed as a metaphor. She delivers it with such anger and intensity and without some other lines to contextualize it, that I'm pretty sure I'm reading this correctly and that Taylor is actually saying that this person deserves actual prison, which is wild, and which makes me think that Taylor is actually leaving out some details about just how bad this person is. So for how intense this takedown is, how much she completely dismantles this man here, I actually think she spared him sharing some of the specific details that would probably be legally questionable to publish. This bridge is just absolutely nuts. And here I go again, but this is the third song on this album that I think features a top 10 all-time Taylor Swift bridge. The bridges on this record are just on another level. All things considered though, this is one of the more difficult songs to rank for me. The first half of this track is fine. It's probably somewhere around the middle of the pack. It's well produced, but it's really simple and bare and doesn't do too much to get me excited. It doesn't really plunge into the depths of sadness that we'd visited on the 2 tracks before, but the bridge is just so outstanding and so intense that the entire song in retrospect feels like this quiet build up to this massive explosion that I just completely adore. So it's a really tough call, and I won't be surprised if my feelings about this song fluctuate one way or another with time. As we approach the end of the original standard version of this record, Taylor introduced a third relationship into the mix. We'll be returning to the previous 2 in the anthology, but for now, track 15, The Alchemy, Taylor is still in the chronology of the last year or so of her life, and as many people anticipated, a Travis Kelce song was bound to come along. And yes, I said I was going to avoid using names that Taylor didn't use, but there's simply no way to explain why this song contains so many sports metaphors without contextualizing in the fact that yes, Taylor is currently in a relationship with a very famous athlete. So forgive me for that. I don't think it's actually speculative at all. I think it's blatant. So Taylor opens this track by saying that the hospital was a drag, playing off the metaphor of her long-term relationship as the dying person that began with You're Losing Me and continued into So Long London, or possibly the asylum that she's also been playing with. But she's back, she's rising up from the dead, she does it all the time if you didn't know, and we dive into the most sincerely uplifting chorus of the whole record to this point. It's just littered with all these sports metaphors each time it comes around, cutting amateurs from the team, winning streaks, the greatest in the league, the bloke swarming the benches, contrasting Travis with the 2 British men it's assumed the prior songs have been about, using that distinctly un-American colloquialism. The highlight of all these lines though is where's the trophy, he just comes running over to me, which we all watch happen on national television. Taylor Swift leads an unfathomably weird life. Also of note here are the lines child's play back at school. We're going to be returning to that metaphor a bit later on, and the line he jokes it's heroin, but this time with an E, alluding to the drug problems of her previous partner and reframing herself as the heroine, as in the hero of her new relationship. Even as we enter into what seems like something totally new with this song, Taylor never fails to tie things together on this album, and this song is no exception. I also think the choice of alchemy instead of the more obvious chemistry is really interesting. Unlike chemistry, alchemy is understood to have this ultimate goal of creating gold, and Taylor has a long history of framing a thriving, healthy relationship as golden, especially the one that just ended. Musically, this one's just such a groove. That intro with its weird, slowed down cha-cha vibes is giving like driving through Miami at night, high on ketamine, listening to Hotline Bling energy. And the track just builds up to an absolutely massive wall of sound by the end. The production on this album has been super creative and strange, and I really struggled to understand why or how so many people seem to think it feels samey. The production on this song feels like nothing Taylor has ever done before, and I love it. I think it's the most interesting and exciting part of the track, and it's one of my favorite bits of instrumentation on the whole record. Taylor ends the standard version of the record with a soul track that doesn't fit into the chronology of the album in any way, but which has kind of a larger message about her life and her career. So track 16 is called Clara Bow. Clara was one of the biggest Hollywood actresses of the 20s and early 30s, who led a tumultuous and controversial life and had frequent emotional breakdowns, and went from the biggest box office draw in the country to dismissed by the industry before she turned 30. And there's a quote from Clara that feels really relevant here that I want to share. She says, "My life in Hollywood contained plenty of uproar. I'm sorry for a lot of it, but not awfully sorry. I never did anything to hurt anyone else. I made a place for myself on the screen, and you can't do that by being Mrs. Alcott's idea of a little woman." This message feels strongly entwined with some of the messages that Taylor herself is conveying in this song, emphasizing that her staying power and her literal power drive and are undeniably connected to her willingness to stand up for herself, to take stances, and make her own decisions, and that she could not do this, and certainly couldn't continue to do this, if she tried to forever project that good girl image with which so many people want to imprison her. This is also far from the first time Taylor has discussed the feeling of being replaced or forgotten in time, like on The Lucky One or Nothing New. On past records, it was usually that her career would stall out. But with that clearly no longer the case, it's turned to a broader and more accurate feeling that one can only ever be the star of their own era, and that in time, inevitably, one becomes a figure of the past. The fact that the three names here, Clara, Stevie, and Taylor, are all women, highlights the undeniable facet of misogyny involved in this. As Taylor discussed in Miss Americana, men don't have to reinvent themselves, don't have to constantly be something new and novel and beautiful to maintain their appeal. But women do, and our culture is more than happy to throw them away once those things are gone. Lines like "picked like a rose," selecting something beautiful knowing that by selecting it you're sentencing it to wither and die, really hammer that message home beautifully. My favorite of the lyrics dealing with this, though, is "the crown is stained, but you're the real thing." It's such a succinct way of conveying the deception inherent in the industry's promises. Pay no mind to the bloodstains that are on the ground. Those are unrelated. It's yours, and you'll wear it like no one else ever has. And of course, the final verse/outro is really the point of the song in a way. It's less important that this has happened in the past than that she knows it's going to keep happening. "You look like Taylor Swift," some record producer or studio exec is going to tell some young girl. Probably already has, and promises her a dazzling future. And when she signs that contract, she's also signing a delayed public cultural death warrant. That this song ends with a line that sounds so promising is precisely the trap that's being laid. And maybe it's just me, I don't know, but something about Taylor singing her own name, like there's the real Taylor, and she's singing about the cultural entity Taylor Swift, made me weirdly emotional. That line sent a shiver down my spine. It's really fascinating to me too that on an album that's so much about relationships, at the end we come back to her fame and her place in the culture and in the music and entertainment industries, because that, more than anything, is the inescapable massive monkey on her back. This is the thing that seeps its way into everything she does. She's written about the way it affects her relationships, her mental health. It's just so integral to her very life at this point, and she, more than anyone, is very aware of the negative impacts it can have on you and the way that it can try to destroy you. And she knows, she's resigned to knowing that there will be others promised what she was promised, and for the ones who aren't taken down by it all like she was, they'll have many painful memories and many deep scars to show for it. At once the simplest and leanest song on the album to this point, and yet at the same time just so perfectly effective and to the point. Just a really solid track. Though I do think it suffers a little bit from the message is bigger than the song syndrome, still it's warming up to me with every listen, and I think it's a really strong and surprising way to end the original version of this record. So Taylor proceeded to surprise everyone by dropping a double album, a whole additional 15 songs, only 4 of which had been known about in advance as the bonus tracks on the different physical editions of the record. And the double album, called The Anthology, begins with one of those tracks, The Black Dog. And this one returns us to the relationship plotlines from the first half of the record, though I'll say in advance that on The Anthology, there's no real clear timeline of events like there is on the first half of the record. We're a bit all over the place back here. So The Black Dog introduces a new thing that's going to appear several times on the back of the album here, which is the experience of Taylor watching her partner from afar, looking for them from a distance, physically separated from them, but with some part of her spirit that's still searching for them everywhere. And here it's happening literally, as Taylor is watching them on her phone as they left their location sharing on, and she's plunged into these two daydreams that blend together. The first is imagining the relationships her former partner will have with other people, and the latter is wondering whether he still thinks about their time together, or whether it doesn't mean anything to him anymore. We get a bit of the theme from Clara Bow back here, actually, as Taylor imagines that her ex will seek out someone who's younger than her, as well as LOML's cowardly lion metaphor returning, and another reference to breathing clean air, placing this after I Can Fix Him, though to be clear, I don't think these two songs are about the same relationship, and conjuring up daylight again. But I think the strongest lyrical threads on this one are Hoax's Best Laid Plans, and Antihero's I Wake Up Screaming from Dreaming One Day I'll Watch As You're Leaving, and Life Will Lose All Its Meaning, which appears to be manifesting here in front of her. And scream she does. The chorus of this song has that same big, explosive, percussive energy of Florida, just a full-on jackhammer pounding guttural intensity. And just like Florida, I completely love it. I think it's one of the most exciting choruses Taylor has done in a long time. And though this track doesn't have quite the level of anger we got on The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, this is still an angry album, make no mistake. With lines like, "Do you hate me? Was it hazing?" This album is full of anger, and it's not gone yet. The end of the bridge here includes some of the most intense lines Taylor has ever written. "Now I want to sell my house and set fire to my clothes, to hire a priest to come and exorcise my demons, even if I die screaming, and I hope you hear it." And it immediately transitions into this altered version of the chorus where she's now saying she hopes the Black Dog is shitty. It's amazing. It's another superb bridge on an album that's already had several, and another big, angry, intense moment on an album that's done those so well. It's one of my favorite tracks on the back of the album for sure. I love the intensity of that musical swell, the sharpness of the lyrics, that big blowout chorus, and the driving melody throughout the whole track. This one just keeps growing on me with every listen. Track 18 is I'm Gonna Get You Back. One big word smashed up like that, which is not something I've managed to decipher yet. If anyone has any thoughts on why she decided to smash the title into one single word like that, let me know, because I'm very curious about that. But what I will say is that we have yet another song title with a clear double meaning in it. This time it's Get You Back, as in reclaiming an escaped love, contrasted with Get You Back, as in getting one's revenge. And the lyrics to this song largely play on that theme. It's definitely a return to the teenage petulance from earlier on the album. Taylor's gonna put on her sexiest skin-tight skirt, she's gonna make her way over to her ex, and either she's gonna tempt him to get back together with her, or she's gonna verbally destroy him and then smash up his bike. She's not sure yet. This song very strongly reminds me of Dress, and I think that's intentional. In addition to opening it with a reference to wearing some sexy bit of clothing, the melodies and the vibe here are just very reminiscent of it. And that really reaches its apex in the post-chorus with the airy delivery of I hear the whispers in your eyes. It just feels too Dress-like to be coincidental. We've also got yet another reference to reckless driving on this one with an explicit recounting of steering an Aston Martin straight into a ditch, which one has to assume is the rental car from The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, as well as the very interesting line, "Era's fading into gray," which Taylor has referenced the blues of her old relationship turning gray on Fresh Out the Slammer, and protested those who only want gray for her on But Daddy I Love Him, but the use of the word eras here is obviously intentional. Is Taylor simply referring to all of her albums leading up to this one? The way her colors have been drained away over the past year with all the grief she's experienced? The way the several colorful albums she's put out about this relationship have now gone gray now that it's over? Or is she suggesting we've reached the end of the eras as such in her career and she's moving on from that concept? I don't know. I'm sure it's at least one of those, possibly multiple, but which one? I'm not sure. It's interesting to think about though if she were to put an end to the era concept that she's only recently begun to really own and lean into. But I'm not convinced she'd even be able to do that if she tried. The fans are going to maintain it anyway. But yeah, I think this is one of the songs with the fewest lyrics to pick through. It's really got one idea that it plays with, and it does it really well, but it doesn't really go too far beyond that. I think for the people who really love this song, it'll mostly be a feeling thing. Just have a really distinct kind of sensual vibe to it that's really fun. But overall, I think it's probably my least favorite chorus on the record, although I should say that I just love when, in the final chorus, Jack does that classic switch up where he drops out all the instrumentation for a second just to bring it back in. I'm always a sucker for that, and it's the highlight of the track for me. Track 19 is the Albatross, and I should preface this with just a brief summary of the most relevant story beats from Samuel Taylor's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So, an old and withered sailor abruptly stops a guest at a wedding to tell him a story from his days at sea. And the guest doesn't want to hear it, but he's persistent and he's weirdly captivating, and he starts telling them about how he shot an albatross for no particular reason, and a horrible curse soon descends upon the ship. The wind completely dies, the crew starts to go insane, and Death himself appears aboard the ship, killing everyone except for this sailor, who is stranded and left alone. But slowly he develops a deep appreciation for all the life at sea, and finally manages to pray and express his gratitude for the beauty of the world. And to make a long story short, he survives. But he's bound with a penance. In exchange for surviving, he's now forced to tell this tale to anyone who will listen, teaching them the lesson that he learned. So as a result of this very famous legend, albatrosses themselves became something of a symbol of death and danger, even though the lesson of the story couldn't be more clear that the albatross was a beautiful part of the natural world and was never a danger. It was attacking it that made it into something dangerous. So in Taylor's version of the rhyme, she's the albatross, and her love interest is constantly being warned about her. She's a danger, she's a bad omen, she's here to destroy you. And her love love interest begins the song by shooting the messengers, ignoring their cautions, and loving the Albatross, seeing it in his dreams. Taylor writes, she's the death that he chose. The Albatross, in turn, warns him about the devils that you know, jackals with raised hackles. Who else but Taylor Swift uses the word hackles in a pop song? She tells him that they'll spread fake news and they'll make him persona non grata. She's been there. She's been falsely labeled as dangerous. She knows how they lie, and she tells him that none of it matters. And when they came to drag him from his bed, the Albatross, Taylor, swoops down to rescue him. There's so much to love about that. First, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is written by one of the old romantics, in contrast to Taylor as a new romantic, a friend of Wordsworth, who's referenced back on the lakes, and Taylor brings back the folklore vibes on this album with a song that's literally about folklore. How can you not love that? And of course, we also get a return to some really beautiful, warm, rich production and instrumentation from Aaron Dessner. And on top of that, I just think the metaphor works exceptionally well. Taylor is absolutely someone who people are warned about, that if you get into a relationship with Taylor, she's gonna write a mean song about you one day. This has been a running joke for like a decade. But like the Albatross, Taylor is not the danger. That's a misunderstanding. It's hurting her. That's the danger. Left unharmed, she's the opposite of dangerous. She's beautiful and freeing and something to be appreciated. The story's been mixed up, just like the rhyme has been. And Taylor acknowledges here that, yeah, if you shoot her, you are in terrible danger and your story will be told for the rest of your days. Except in this case, she's the one who will be telling it. I just think that is such a clever idea. Like, at some point in this woman's brain, she decided that she was going to make herself the Albatross in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. That was an idea that she came up with. How wild is that? Who does that? When people compare big pop artists, who sells more albums, who has the biggest tour, who wins the most awards, who gets the best reviews, tell me who the fuck else is retelling epic poetry from the 1700s. Like, come on, man. She's on another level. I also really appreciate that the ending is left quite open to interpretation. Like, did Taylor save her partner from the situation that could have been devastating for him? Did he not believe her and he got pulled away, convinced that she was dangerous? Was her fame and reputation too much and he eventually bought the lies? The framing of the last verse and chorus are fairly ambiguous in this regard, and I like that a lot personally. I'm a big open-ended final scene guy. Like, I love when movies leave my imagination to fill in the rest, and while I know a lot of people hate that, I'm really happy with the uncertainty about exactly how this story is finished. This is easily one of the best songs on the album in my book. Really beautiful production that just feels straight out of the best parts of Folklore and Evermore, and really compelling and totally unique lyrical ideas that still somehow completely tie in to the themes that the rest of the record has been exploring. This song just feels like a magic spell. I really think this is something special. So Aaron's really distinctive production returns for track 20, and one of the most curious track titles on the album, Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus. Now the back half of this album touches on a handful of different topics distinctly unrelated from the main two relationship threads that fill up the front half. And though I think this song is clearly about a relationship, there are a lot of indications here that this isn't about any of the three relationships that she's already discussed in this album. Though on first listen, I assume the reference to "you needed drugs more" must be tying this song back to the short-lived con-man relationship, because there were clearly drugs involved in that. There are some strong signs here that this might be about something else. The reference to "the decade would play us for fools," Taylor's many changes of outfits and lovers in the time since they've been together, her being impaired by her youth, her desertion of this partner, and her prolonged wondering of what might have been, all pretty clearly rule out that relationship. However, if you'll indulge me, and shout out to Emily, the same friend who wrote me the impassioned defense of Enchanted and swayed my opinion on that song, she helped me see some curious signs throughout this song, in addition to matching the aforementioned qualities. There's the undefined gender of her ex's new partner in the title of the song. The chorus's refrain of asking if they have always wondered is very similar to some of the lyrics on Question, where she's similarly asking an ex what-ifs about a past relationship, a song which itself samples and ties back to Out of the Woods. I crashed into you like so many wrecks do also brings to mind Out of the Woods and Is It Over Now? There's also the very deliberate choice of words Scarlet and Maroon here, which call back to the relationship on Maroon, where she says rust grew between telephones. My desertion of you feels strongly reminiscent of her departure on Say Don't Go. Say You Loved Me also ties back to Say Don't Go's I said I love you, you said nothing. Our phantoms also kind of sounds like two ghosts. Make of that what you will. I present these findings for your consideration only. Do your own research, come to your own conclusions. Just something I thought you might like to chew over. At any rate, I just think the twinkling, bright guitar slides that float above the main acoustic guitar melody on this song are so pretty. The instrumentation and production here just feels so classic, and the melody reminds me of like 60s, 70s country ballads, like Seven Spanish Angels type stuff. It's just an immediately really nostalgic sound despite these undeniably modern lyrics. And I have to say that little piano trill is also extremely similar to the one at the very end of Champagne Problems, but I don't know what to do with that information either. This song is complex and interesting, and I could see people interpreting it in pretty wildly different ways. But the one thing that there's no denying is that, yet again, Taylor's vocals are so gorgeous here. The verses are so wordy, and she delivers them with this effortless elegance, and the way she sings Wondered towards the back of the track really, really gets me. How Did It End is track 21, but in a different and important sense, this is also track 5B, as it's the 5th track on the 2nd record. And that's very much how I think of it, because boy oh boy, does this track hit like a Taylor Swift track 5. And I guess I want to start my discussion of this one with a little bit of a personal rant, if you'll tolerate it. As I said, I've been married for 10 years, and trying to neatly and concisely sum up what went wrong in a serious long-term adult relationship is inconceivable to me. Like, unless there was some singular, blatant thing, someone just randomly started cheating on the other one, there was no coming back from it, unless there's something that clear-cut, in 99% of circumstances, long-term relationships develop a social, physical, emotional, and practical complexity that you just can't wrap up in a song. The expectation that she would be able to do so, that she would even herself fully understand everything that went wrong in a way that could be articulated with honesty, and she says here in the final lines, but I still don't know how did it end, is just unreasonable. And I feel like anyone who was expecting a breakup song about that relationship was going into this with a fundamental misunderstanding. Taylor may have been able to do songs like that with past relationships, ones that lasted far, far less long and were thus vastly less complicated. And she may have been able to do it when she was younger and more willing to trust her own perspective on a relationship's flaws. And she may have been able to do that when she had not spent years being invested in the well-being of a partner and was willing to accept the backlash they'd receive if she said bad things about them. And indeed, we saw her willingly do that with her much more short-term relationship earlier on this record. But could she possibly do that with a relationship that she's been writing about over 6 years and 5 albums, which clearly teetered on the verge of marriage? Of course not. That they learned the right steps to different dances, that they fell out of sync, doesn't just feel like a vague metaphor. It honestly sounds about as specific as you can get when dealing with trying to describe a really long and complex relationship. But that empathetic hunger desires a clear explanation in detail as it's gotten in the past. It's happening again, the world says. Tell us, how did it end? It doesn't work that way. And I only say this because if you've never really been in a super long-term relationship, maybe that's not obvious, but she just literally can't. It doesn't work that way. She can't tell you. So how does it end? I'm completely infatuated with this song. The metaphor Taylor pulls out here of the hothouse flower to her outdoorsman right from the start, just so good. Like, what a flawless, beautiful way to try to capture the complexities of their disconnect in just a few words. And Taylor is so aware that people want more than that they want to know every detail. But what can she say? We were blind to unforeseen circumstances. Time happened. Things changed. Life happened. People want different things. They move in different directions. But the people demand, how did it end? I think it's best captured in the second chorus, if you can even call it a chorus, where Taylor writes, guess who we ran into at the shops, walking in circles like she was lost. Didn't you hear they called it all off? One gasp and then, how did it end? The gasp isn't followed by, oh my God, is she okay? Or, oh, poor Taylor, that's so sad. Or, oh, that's really unfortunate. I hope they're doing well. It's just, how did it end? God, that's just so fucking sad to me. Is that as sad to you all as it is to me? To have your life become an entertainment show? To have invasions of your privacy valued over your well-being? It's just so sad. And it's followed by, say it once again with feeling, how the death-rattled breathing silenced as the soul was leaving. As though her simply recounting this horrific and traumatizing experience is not sufficient. She has to do it with feeling. Make us feel, Taylor. We want to feel how sad you are, Taylor. Just squeezing her pain until they can get every drop of their enjoyment out of it. It's not hungry empathy, it's empathetic hunger, and that's an important distinction. This song, you guys, there's so much more I could say about this one, but I feel like you just need to spend time with this song and let it sink into your bones. This song's emotional impact on me is rivaled only by All Too Well. Honestly, that she turned the request for the knowledge about her breakup into a song about the request. The little lift and fall at the end of every line of the verses, the delivery of how did it end every time. Taylor Swift is an artistic genius. I say that with no hyperbole. I don't qualify that with the context of in pop music or whatever. I'm a guy who wrote nearly 200,000 words about her work, and still sometimes she just leaves me speechless, and that's what this track does. Thankfully for my soul and well-being, Taylor lifted me up from the crumbled pile on the floor for track 22, So High School. Of all the songs on the album, this one warrants the least in terms of deep literary analysis. Not because the lyrics aren't great, I actually love the lyrics here, but just because the themes of this song are not wrapped in poetic riddles. This song is as open and straightforward as the relationship it describes. And along with the Alchemy, it's one of only 2 songs that are completely unironically upbeat and happy on this record, which makes sense as they're the 2 tracks that are clearly about her current relationship, which seems to be going pretty well right now. Most of what I would have to say about this song is probably obvious or has already been said before, but just a few things I can't fail to mention. The line, you knew what you wanted and boy you got her, and are you gonna marry, kiss, or kill me, much like the line on the Alchemy about running for Taylor instead of the trophy, are things that we all watched happen very publicly, i.e. Travis publicly declaring his attempt to give Taylor a friendship bracelet and ask her out, and that resurfaced clip of Travis playing this very game. This is a stark contrast to unraveling the mysteries of her other relationships. That's not to say the public knows everything about Taylor's current relationship. I'm sure we know practically nothing about it, all things considered. But what we do know and have seen still very strongly and clearly contrasts with the shrouded metaphors that are used to paint the two that dominate the first half of this record. But mostly what I want to talk about here is Taylor Swift saying, "Watching American Pie with you on a Saturday night," which is just such a funny thing for Taylor to be doing in 2024. And then one of the greatest and funniest things that she has ever written, "You know how to ball, I know Aristotle. Touch me while your boys play Grand Theft Auto." This is an insane thing to put into a song. I just called this woman one track ago an unequivocal creative genius, and she really just put those words onto this album. She's done some wild stuff on past records, but this is as wild as it gets. It may never be surpassed. I can't believe she's gonna have me singing the words, "Touch me while your boys play Grand Theft Auto." What has become of my life? How did I get here? Musically, this one's just an exceptionally well-balanced composition. The choruses, verses, and bridge/outro are all equally catchy, with absolutely no low points. The momentum of this song just rides all the way through and never loses steam or novelty for a moment. It's just a classic, excellent pop song, and more proof that if Taylor wanted to release an album of 10 clean, simple bangers like some people apparently wanted, she could do it without breaking a sweat. So after that brief detour into upbeat, romantic excitement, we're plunging right back down again with track 23, I Hate It Here. Tracks 21 through 25 on this album are an absolute roller coaster of tones and emotions, and I can understand why some people feel like the back half of this album offers more diversity than the first half. I also think there's an argument to be made that we're bouncing all over the place back here in comparison to the relatively steady hike of the first half of the record. At any rate, we're into another acoustic guitar-led Aaron Dessner track, and the guitar layers are really super pretty here and feel very organic, with the loud finger slides once again left in the recording unedited. It's one of my very favorite sonic palettes of the whole album. It's simultaneously such a simple and such a rich instrumentation that creates a super unique atmosphere. And the melody of the chorus, the way each line is sung, just conveys so much emotion while remaining strangely ambiguous. It's some sort of vague longing, a melancholy, a disappointment. It's fascinating how this manages to make me feel something so strongly while also leaving me kind of at a loss to adequately describe what it is that I'm feeling exactly. This track deals with responding to trauma and pain in life with escapism, entering to romanticized ideals in your mind, and as I've already discussed a few times, the breaking down of romanticized ideals is a pretty central theme to this record, nowhere more so than here. In her romantic, lucid dreams, Taylor visits secret gardens and has fantasies of lunar valleys, but she knows in actuality that the things that she romanticizes, like her nostalgic longing for the past that we saw on the lakes and Timeless, would not, in reality, match her vision of them. She recounts a story of her awkwardly pointing out to her friends that the 1830s would be great, without all the racism and dowries, and it broke the spell of nostalgic daydreaming that everyone had been under. "Nostalgia is a mind's trick," she said. "If I'd been there, I'd hate it." If she'd been in the palace, the castle that she so frequently evoked, it would have actually been freezing and miserable. And yet, in spite of this, she can't help but escape there in her mind over and over, because in her mind, romanticized ideals can come true. Taylor is a dreamer at heart, someone whose inner world is not merely a reflection of the outer world, but a rich and colorful land unto itself, where things work differently than they do out here in collective reality. And as someone whose primary hobby is world building, I've probably never related to a song in Taylor's catalog more than this one. Taylor opens and closes this track with a reference to a man telling her that he's a poet trapped inside the body of a finance guy, which feels exactly like the kind of awful, cheesy line someone who's absolutely not a poet would say to someone like Taylor Swift in order to persuade her that he's more interesting than he is. It's unclear who said this line. It's not really a song about any individual or any relationship, but whoever said it, Taylor's rolling her eyes so hard that she had to write it down and put it in a song. She seems to be recollecting more interesting lives that she's lived than this one that somehow landed her in this awful conversation. And this isn't the last time that past lives are going to be referenced on this album. We'll get another reference a few songs from now. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around exactly where Taylor's at in her own headspace with this idea, whether it's literal or metaphorical. I think that might just be a secret for Taylor. It's a really curious track overall, one which feels like a substantial deviation from everything that's come before it on the album. Like Clara Bow, this one feels like a standalone track that kind of operates outside of the major themes of the album while still being tied into it just enough to keep it from floating away or feeling like it shouldn't be here at all. We're going to run into a few more of these here at the end of the record, where Taylor seems to have placed most of her song ideas that didn't fit neatly into the larger narrative that she was crafting. Well, if there are two tracks on this record that don't really warrant much in the way of analysis because they just come right out and tell you what they mean and what they're about, it's So High School and then track 24, Thank You, aIMee. In the fewest possible words, this is Mean Part 2. Taylor's "You were cruel to me and I'm going to be wildly successful while you sitting there watching me thinking about what a bad person you are" song. And given that Taylor quite literally did include this person's name here by capitalizing the letters of the title, I don't think we need to pretend it's not perfectly clear that this is a song about Kim Kardashian. And really understanding what Kim did to Taylor, the intentional deception in releasing a deliberately edited recording of the phone call that Kanye had with Taylor preceding the release of Famous, then establishing the social media trend of referring to Taylor as a snake, is pretty instrumental to understanding why this song exists. For an album where Taylor has not been shy to express anger, and for a song that has "fuck you" in every chorus, this is a decidedly chill and upbeat track. Taylor frames Kim as a spray-tanned high school bully who seeks out unfair fights, fuels media attacks against her, and then reframes it in her own mind that she was never actually aggressive or intentionally mean towards her and didn't seriously hurt her. But it wasn't a clean kill, both in the sense that Taylor survived and in that the full recording of the phone call was eventually released, exonerating Taylor, who proceeded to have a creative renaissance in the years that followed. Taylor's dramatic change of her personal brand with Reputation and the introduction of much more unabashed anger and intensity to her lyricism is something that it seems like Taylor looks back on as an essential change to her success. It doesn't excuse what Kim did, but getting kicked down and having lies spread about her was a source of inspiration and determination and personal and creative growth, the fruits of which she's continuing to harvest to this day. As someone who went through Taylor's catalog all in a very short period of time, Reputation did feel to me like a massive turning point for her creative ambition. If that wouldn't have happened without Kim, then I guess I owe her a thank you as well, because she very much accidentally and with the worst possible intentions helped spur onward the most prolific and culturally important pop artist of our generation. As much as I've been trying to stay away from other people's takes on this album, the one line that many people have mentioned to me about this song is the one about Taylor's mom, which, yeah, I bet her mom did say that. There's nothing too surprising or offensive to me about it. Moms are gonna mom, man. What did you expect? Although I do wish I could have overheard the conversation where Taylor ran that lyric by Andrea, though. That must have been a pretty funny moment. Like, are you okay with me mentioning that you said this? My personal favorite moments of this song lyrically are the lines, "I don't think you've changed much, and so I changed your name in any real defining clues," which is hilarious in both the absolute truth of the first line and the absolute lie of the second one. That just cracks me up. I really love the transition that the chorus undergoes over the course of the song, from "blood was gushing" to "the stars are stunning," and from "I can't forgive the way you made me feel" to "I couldn't wait to show you it was real" to "and our town that looks so small from way up here." Taylor's so big, and her influence and presence in the zeitgeist is so powerful that she's saying all this beef is so small way down below her, and I love that. This is the modern "someday I'll be living in a big old city." But yeah, I might not think this is the most interesting song on the album to deeply analyze and sit with, but like Mean, it's just fun to sing an upbeat, fuck you kind of song. It warms the heart, And I really enjoy the verse melody on this song, especially in the more stripped down third verse. It reminds me a bit of a song called Bear by the Antlers, so if you enjoy this song, go check that one out. I strongly suspect that you'll like it too. Just really pretty, light, fun instrumentals and a refreshing moment of ease and joy and catharsis on a very heavy record that has few of any of those things. Track number 25, I Look in People's Windows, is one of only 2 tracks on this album, the other being the opener, Fortnight, to feature a producer other than Jack or Aaron, this one being co-produced between Jack and Patrick Berger, which is the same duo that produced Slut from the 1989 Vault tracks. And once again, the two of them knock it out of the park, with a strong contender for my favorite production on all of the anthology tracks and a contender for my favorite production on the whole album. This song feels like a very important meeting point for several themes that have cropped up across the back half of the record. We've got Watching Your Ex from Afar from the Black Dog, we've got Speculating About Their Lives Without You and Chloe et al., we've got Dismantling Romanticized Ideals from I Hate It Here. They all kind of come together in this really bare, quiet narrative, probably the fewest words of any track on the album, of just Taylor looking into people's windows. This track's thesis statement is the very simple, "I'm afflicted by the not knowing." Taylor might be able to escape into her mind at ease, but just the same, her mind wanders through speculations and hypotheticals, imagining all the ways things could have been. Her endlessly running imagination is a blessing and a curse, and here it's in full curse mode. This line makes me think of the opening track from Folklore, which is sort of the gateway to these last 4 albums, where she's already asking, if one thing had been different, would everything be different? And really, this is just another one of those axis points where 1,000 lyrical threads come together, so let's talk about some of them. The title line brings to mind Death by 1,000 Cuts, I look through the windows of this love, and especially Midnight Rains, so I peered through a window, a deep portal, time travel, which establishes this as a habit that's not new to Taylor. And because in the modern age, windows are almost certainly not literal, it also calls to mind a line from way back on Last Kiss, where she says, "So I'll watch your life in pictures like I used to watch you sleep." That line about attending Christmas parties from the outside contrasts with lovers leaving the Christmas lights up, parallels anti-heroes too big to hang out, and in particular makes me think of Right Where You Left Me's, "I'm sure that you've got a wife out there, kids in Christmas, but I'm unaware." Interestingly, Taylor seems to not only be looking in the windows, but there's this one other narrative woven into this very short and simple song, which are these small and specific memories in the first verse and the first lines of the second verse. It seems like as Taylor is looking through the windows, she's simultaneously recalling one particular moment, and I strongly suspect this was the last time her and her partner saw one another, when he stopped and tilted his head before the two of them boarded opposite trains, and she still ponders about that too. What if she saw him again and their eyes met one more time. This thought haunts her and compels her and drives her into what is likely unhealthy behavior, but she's addicted to the if only. I just think it's such a beautifully simple and clean track. It manages to conjure up so much feeling in barely more than 2 minutes and with only one real metaphor. But the imagery is just so strong that it carries the song anyway. And again, the production is just so odd and beautiful here. The vocal layering, two of the most unique melodies on the whole record, both in the verse and the chorus. That thumping bass that punctuates each chorus line, and that high glistening guitar recorded raw again with all those little finger slides picked up. It's just such a full, atmospheric, well-mixed sound that feels so intimate. It makes you feel like you're right there next to Taylor as she's thinking these things, even inside her head. And that really effectively increases the emotional impact of these feelings she's describing. It's just really smart, creative production from Jack, Patrick, and Taylor. Track 26, The Prophecy, is a surprisingly tragic song on an album that's already full of tragic songs. I wasn't really expecting this one to come through and just knock the wind out of me one more time as we're getting into the back of the album, but Taylor had one more gut punch cocked and loaded. I've talked a few times now about the role of fate in this album. Ill-fated and fateful both crop up from as early as the prologue, and this song is where the role of fate, of Taylor's deep fatalism, really comes out in full. Taylor's not hidden her deep love of fantasy and folklore. It's been around since the Princesses and Castle and Shakespeare of her first few albums, and it's appeared again and again since then. We just got a whole song about it with I Hate It Here. While Taylor's perception of her own place within that mythos appears to be someone who has made a classic deal with the devil, like Robert Johnson taking his guitar down to the crossroads, or like Eve taking a bite of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She's been afflicted with a curse, one that's ensured her fame and money, untold success and wealth, critical and popular acclaim, but in exchange, she's traded away any real hope of lasting love. Now, does Taylor truly believe this? Does it seem absurd to you that she might? If you were one of the most famous living beings in the entire known universe, which Taylor Swift irrefutably is, it's very hard to say what kind of worldview might develop. People might think I'm crazy for saying so, but Taylor may well sincerely see her fame and success as so remarkable and unlikely that she genuinely finds herself wondering if there's some sort of cosmic karma at work that won't let her have love too. I don't think that would be any more strange or unlikely than people who are honestly invested in tarot readings or astrology. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, you know? So the thesis of this song is Taylor begging, pleading with the fates. She'll give anything. She'll give her last dime. More specifically, she'll spend a coin with the kind of double meaning of casting a wish into a well. But she'll give it all. She just wants someone who wants her company. But the nature of a prophecy is, of course, that it cannot be changed. It's fated. End of the story. But what's so tragic about this song is that she thought she had disproved it. That she caught lightning in a bottle this time. She really did. A visual that brings to mind the invisible string in the Willow music video. But, oh, it's gone again. Like, fuck, man. My heart. And she pounds it home even harder with the line, and I sound like an infant, feeling like the very last drops of an ink pen. Taylor has written so many words about this relationship. She's been writing about her love for this guy for 5 solid albums now. There's so much confidence and surety and conviction in so many of those words, and it didn't work. And now her pen is drying up. Calling herself an infant, I think Taylor feels embarrassed. Like, she wrote all of this, and look at how wrong she was. She was so sure she was right the whole time. It's just devastatingly sad to me. Before I fall too deep into that, there are some other notable things happening with the lyrics here. We've got a return to the witch metaphor with the sorceress's table, a reference to a children's fairy tale with the wound of the pricked hand. More of these are coming up later. And the use of the word grayish, which is a shade of gray that's slightly warm. So in other words, gray with the distinct absence of blue. I'm telling you, this song just keeps kicking you when you're down. And perhaps most interestingly of all, and another shout out to Emily for this one, I wouldn't have got this. The shift to the passive voice for the line slows the quicksand, which is very unusual for Taylor. Except in Invisible String, where she used it constantly. Green was the grass, cold was the seal, bad was the blood, etc. And now slow was the quicksand. As that was a song which dealt specifically with the idea of a positive fate, that these two were destined to be together, tied together by the invisible string. And as the lightning in a bottle visual and even the little acoustic guitar riff in this song feel like they're harkening back to it, I think this track is, in more ways than one, a very heartbreaking sequel to Invisible String. What else is there to say, man? It's beautiful, it's heartbreaking, it's classic air and ethereal guitar work, the lyrics. It's a great track. Next up, track 27 is Cassandra, and we're keeping our fate and witch themes running. For those who might be unaware, in Greek mythology, Cassandra was an oracular Trojan woman, in other words, a prophetess and a witch, who tried to warn the Trojans about the deception that would lead to their doom, but was ignored, for such a grim prophecy was easily dismissed as inconceivable. In the play Agamemnon by Aeschylus, she finally snaps, like a mad woman, you might say, becoming possessed by Apollo, channeling prophecies, spitting a torrent of chaotic wisdom, telling of the past and the future, after which she is murdered. I think that alone sets the the stage pretty well for the way in which Taylor relates to Cassandra's story. And there's also some definite sonic connections between this track and Mad Woman. The little piano on both tracks has a very similar tone, and her vocal cadence in this one seems to nearly mirror the piano melody on Mad Woman. This song strikes me as very likely being a kind of sister track to Thank You aIMee, once again recalling the events that took place back in 2016 when Taylor was publicly chastised and ridiculed for apparently lying to play the victim, which is much more strongly recalled in our cultural, pop culture memory than the fact that she was later vindicated. When I've talked to people about this story over the years, even before I found Taylor's music, I frequently found that people aren't aware of the release of the full call recording. They just remember the backlash against Taylor. They just remember that she lied. And that seems to be one of the driving themes here. Taylor writes, when it's burn the bitch, they're shrieking. When the truth comes out, it's quiet. And also of note is the intentional use of the word bitch, which is the very word that Kanye did not clear with Taylor on that phone call. What's interesting here is that Taylor, after having thanked aIMee for helping her elevate her career and helping her grow, seems to be revealing a backside to that coin. They say what doesn't kill you makes you aware. What happens if it becomes who you are? She asks. Taylor's reminding us here that there are downsides to what happened that have also persisted. Sure, it helped her in some ways, but it also gave her a permanent wound and changed who she is. And she also calls out in the bridges here that there were people who were aware that Kim was misrepresenting what had happened, but it would have been bad for their brand to rebuke her. Blood's thick, but nothing like a payroll, she says. And once again, she refers to the holier-than-thou faux Christian performativity that seems to be particularly getting under her skin across this album. I find it really curious that both this song and Thank You aIMee made it onto this album at all. I have to think that maybe they emerged from the fact that Taylor has been recently re-recording Reputation, revisiting the cell that they filled with snakes, and was likely going back through unreleased tracks from that record in the process, perhaps unearthing some memories and finding herself contemplating on how much that turn of events impacted her life and how that impact has reverberated throughout her career since. I certainly wasn't expecting this topic to show up even once on this album, let alone twice. I feel very similarly about this song as I do about I Can Fix Him, No Really I Can. Both songs remind me so much of Mad Woman and No Body No Crime respectively, the first of which is probably my least favorite song on Folklore, and the second is probably my least favorite song on Evermore. So for the same reason that I imagine a lot of people who loved Mad Woman will love this song, it's toward the bottom of my rankings on this album. It's just a subject that doesn't hit me emotionally like many of the others on this record do, and it's probably got the least impactful chorus melody for me as well. Still a really solid track, one that I like more than a significant portion of her catalog, and it's still not a skip for me, but just overshadowed by how great so much of this record is. In much the same way that The Prophecy feels like it could be a sequel to Invisible String, track number 28, Peter, picks up on the Peter Pan metaphor from Cardigan and rolls it into its own song. And first I should say that I'm totally biased in favor of this song. My name is Peter, and so when I hear Taylor singing my name on this, my primal unconscious lizard brain just like screams and thrashes around, and I don't think there's anything I can do to permanently shut that down. So I'm just destined to have a soft spot for this track no matter what. But I'm pretty sure I've been able to analyze this track with my adult conscious brain long enough, and I think it's pretty great anyways, so you tell me if I'm wrong. So in addition to the callback to Peter losing Wendy and Cardigan, there's Let the Lamp Burn here, which also seems to parallel Cardigan and then fresh out the slammer's Porch Light, and also Ivy's widow who sits and grieves for the living. We've also got yet another reference to fate in the goddess of timing and more descriptions of falling out of sync with someone underneath the same moon in different galaxies. That reminds me of So Long London and How Did It End? But the lyrical connections that really stand out to me on this one are both connecting back to Reputation, the first album where Taylor wrote about the relationship that's only recently ended, with the curious line crossing your jet stream, calling back to Call It What You Once, Fly Like a Jet Stream, and then the very specific But You Were 25, with Dancing with Her Hands Tied, Oh 25 years old, oh how are you to know? Each of these feels so specific, such unusual things to mention without it having been deliberate. Given that Cardigan is almost certainly about the same relationship as the Reputation songs, I think this one must be as well, which was quite a puzzle for me at first, as this song sure seems to suggest that the relationship at hand never happened, or a really long break was taken and it never came back together. But I think that might have been an excessively literal interpretation on my part. I'm now inclined to think that the growing up and coming to find me that Taylor's describing here has more to do with maturity and the development of their relationship, and ties in with the many references we've seen in her songs over the past few years about wanting to get married and start a family, and it just never happened. She was waiting for Peter to grow up enough to be that partner, to meet her where she was, to come down from his youth, and he didn't. Peter never leaves Neverland, and Wendy can't wait forever. Forgive me, Peter, she sings, as in So Long London she makes it clear that she was the one who finally pulled the string when she just couldn't take it anymore. Both that song and this song feel strongly colored by guilt. Like she feels bad about the end of the relationship, feels bad that she had to call it, even though she knows it was time, beyond time. On top of all that, just to put a bow on top of it and tie it into Reputation one more time, there's the line at the end, please know that I tried to hold on to the days when you were mine, which in unison with those familiar piano chords simply must be a reference to New Year's Day and hold on to the memories, they will hold on to you. The more I ponder this interpretation, the more it feels like one of the best metaphors on the album. I really love it. This album is so much. I love it to bits. The layers and the references and the lyrical threads and the metaphors here are so much deeper than she's even thought about doing before. It's incredible. Track number 29 is The Bolter, and it's one last gasp of fresh, clean air in this album that's just been so heavy and so intense. This track strikes me as kind of an optimistic counterpoint to The Prophecy. Taylor starts by describing a curious child with a bewitching face who nearly drowns in frigid water, which is super interesting, and it's one of the only moments on the entire record that feels like it's either a reference totally beyond my grasp or just pure storytelling at work. Taylor earlier on I Hate It Here called herself a precocious child, and she's played with the idea of herself as a witch enough times that I'm entirely confident the titular Bolter is Taylor. But did Taylor almost drown in frigid water? Did that happen? If not, what did happen? This is one of those really puzzling lines that, in a dream scenario where I get to ask Taylor a few questions, I would love to know the answer to. At any rate, having survived what ought to have been her death, escaping what fate had in store for her, she's essentially freed herself in an almost metaphysical sense. She's got an inherent ability to get out of bad situations and chases after the high of freedom. The bridge really serves to summarize the whole story here in a way. She's been many places with men of many faces, but when she sees signs of danger, she's out, she bolts. The detail of which relationship is being discussed here is less relevant than ever, although the lines "called her a whore" and "town car speeding" do seem to allude to high fidelity and getaway car, so make of that what you will. The main takeaway here, though, is that Taylor's describing a very different kind of escapism than the one that she does into her own mind. A literal escape from people who darken her world, who were the ones that make her hate it here. But as a result, she's got the best stories. If The Prophecy portrayed her relationships as doomed to fail, so does The Bolter, but here their failure is an escape into freedom, the process of breaking hearts and collecting stories. Taylor doing what she does best, transforming her pain into music in order to be free of it. More on that later. And when contrasting this song with The Prophecy, I strongly suspect that Taylor feels both very strongly, perhaps simultaneously, but in different moments. When she's down low, she's begging the gods of fate to change the prophecy, and when she's riding high, she knows she's the story-collecting, ever-moving Bolter. To paraphrase Whitman, does she contradict herself? Very well, she contradicts herself. She is large, she contains multitudes. I, for one, love the reframing of this concept in two very different lights. It's just human, to see one aspect of your life as both a curse and a blessing, depending on the day, on your mood, on where you are in your life. We all do it in our own ways, or at least I know I do. And I should note that Past Lives appear here for the second time on the album, after I Hate It Here as well, and the third time in total across her catalog, with the first having been Dear Reader, when Taylor instructs, desert all your past lives. I'm still wrangling with this concept, but it seems to me that in each of the references, the past lives seem like they're something that have this lingering, prolonged, subtle effect on her, like they're woven into her fate, simultaneously sources of pain and weight, and also things that remind her of her power and liberate her from fear. Very intriguing, and something worth digging into more deeply if anyone wants to take a crack at that. This song also has an energy that reminds me strongly of When Emma Falls in Love, which is a song that shares both musical and lyrical commonalities with this one, but even more so than Emma, this song just has such a sticky chorus. Easily one of the most memorable on the whole album. Super sweet, super bright, and fittingly would have worked well on Fearless or Speak Now. That said, I think it's counterbalanced a bit by one of the only bridges that doesn't really stand out to me on the record. I love the lyrics of the bridge here, but that bum 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 cadence on the bridge doesn't really do much for me, and I'm mostly spending it getting hyped for the really playful delivery of "there's escape in escaping" as the song drops back into the final chorus. The penultimate track, and the single most mysterious song on the record for me, is track number 30, Robin. Despite rivaling I Look in People's Windows for the sparsity of the lyricism, this song is twice as long, with each line and nearly each word drawn out to create this slow, really soft, gradual, lilting atmosphere that's unique not just to this album, but really in Taylor's whole catalog. And what's also unique is the subject of the lyrics here, which is itself not an easy thing to describe. The you in the song, Robin presumably, appears to be describing a child covered in mud, playing with dinosaurs and jumping on a trampoline, although the very opening verse is much more vague in that regard, and I can't really rule out that it may be describing an actual Robin, like the bird seen through window panes, talking utter nonsense. And if it sounds like I have no idea what exactly Taylor's going for in this song, if I can't even be sure if a verse is about a bird or a child, or frankly if it's entirely possible it's about her cats, then yeah, you've correctly met me where I'm at with this one. This is an exceedingly vague song. I'm totally confident that at least some of it is about a child, but what child? Is it Christopher Robin of the 100-Acre Wood? Is it Taylor herself? Is it some child who's in Taylor's life? The child of like a friend of hers for whom she's like an aunt, perhaps? I saw it mentioned online that Aaron has a son named Robin. Is it about him or just named in his honor? Completely unrelated to any of that? This track contains a great deal more mystery for me than any other song on the whole record. But what I will say about it is that this would not be the first time Taylor has written with great emotion about childhood. Never Grow Up and Seven both touch on similar themes to this song, and the desire to preserve and protect childhood innocence and in the unabashed ability to scream ferociously anytime you want. So Taylor clearly has a lot of feelings about this topic, and it may be as simple as she's thinking a lot about the kids in her life and the relationships between parents and their children. As I get older and into my 30s, I find myself reflecting back on my own childhood, which seems increasingly distant. I used to feel like I was just a kid who was transported into an adult's body, but more and more the years grow in the gap, and I'm inclined to view it in a more romanticized way. And what's unique about Childhood on an album full of Taylor dismantling romanticized ideals is that it actually isn't an ideal that you romanticize internally. It's one that you create for someone else. Like good parents, loving parents, vow to keep a secret from their children in sweetness. And that message is the most impactful part of the song for me. What's the secret that they're keeping? There's not really a clear answer to that, but we kind of all know just inherently, don't we? It's something vaguely to do with the fact that life is full of pain, and we're all going to get sick, and we're all going to get old, and we're all going to die. And in the meantime, we're all going to pay bills and taxes, and our friends will drift away, and we'll accidentally hurt people we love, and life is complicated and hard, and suffering is inescapable. The secret's kind of all of that at once. Go play with your dinosaurs. I'll make you a grilled cheese. Tomorrow we'll go to the park. That feels like the secret to me. I think it's entirely possible this is just something that's present in Taylor's mind right now as someone who is an intelligent, contemplative person. Her life isn't all relationships and fame. She just thinks about stuff sometimes and it makes her feel things. Musically, this track is as sparse as it is lyrically, but it's got some really lovely instrumentation in there. And I'm particularly fond of the super warm, muffled guitar around 1 minute and 30 seconds in, which is very reminiscent of the piano melody played in the intro to Peace. And while I think Peace is about a very different kind of desire to give someone peace than this song is, I do think it would be a pretty fitting connection that I can't rule out being intentional. Or it could just be Aaron doing Aaron stuff. At any rate, very possibly the most curious song on the album, and the one that I've alternated between really connecting with and bouncing off, depending on my mood. I'd be curious to know how parents out there feel about this one. I don't have any kids. If I did, would this song hit different? Feels like it probably would. Alright, here we are on the final track of the Tortured Poets Department, the anthology, track 31, the Manuscript. I have no idea whether my interpretation of this track is a hot take or completely obvious, because it seems fascinating and compelling, and I would have imagined that if people were interpreting it this way, I would have stumbled across some mention of it online by now, but I've also been largely avoiding reading too much about other people's reviews and analyses so as to have an unadulterated opinion on this record. So hear me out, then tell me whether this is crazy and you totally disagree, or whether this is actually what everybody already knows and agrees on. So I don't think this song is about any of the relationships that have been alluded to so far on this album. This is about a relationship that Taylor had when she was quite young. She was imagining being 30, which must have felt like a ways off at the time to be worth imagining at all. Taylor was still in her sleeping in mom's bed eating cereal for breakfast years, but she was naively hopeful at the time that it could be a relationship that would lead to marriage and children. But her partner seemed more interested in sex for the sex than starting a family. She says that he told her because she was so wise beyond her years, everything had been above board, and she wasn't sure. I think you could easily interpret this song as being about the same relationship as the lines, "Don't you think I was too young?" and "Give me back my girlhood, it was mine first," from Dear John and Would've, Could've, Should've, respectively. I think that's totally valid, and that was definitely my first instinct as well. But the bridge then leans heavily into the metaphor of filmmaking. Actors are hitting their marks, and then the cincher lines for me, and the slow dance was alight with the sparks, and the tears fell in synchronicity with the score. Taylor's first film, the all too well 10-minute version short film, includes actors slow dancing in very specific and deliberate lighting, as well as a scene in which Sadie Sink brilliantly and heartbreakingly cries in synchronicity with the score, the song itself. And it's this experience that seems to make Taylor realize what the agony had been for. Yes, Taylor has transformed heartbreak into beautiful music countless times, but it's this specific example that she chooses here out of everything she could have referenced. Which brings us into the final verse on the album. Taylor's holding a manuscript, one last souvenir from her trip to your shores, something that she rereads now and again. And it's entirely possible that this is merely a reference to this album itself. This record being the final one about this relationship she's written about for so long. Once again, I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation. But we also do know that Taylor Swift signed a deal with Searchlight Pictures back in 2022 in order to direct an original script that she wrote. I'm just saying, she did that. She wrote a manuscript in the most common, least allegorical, least metaphorical sense of the term. We already know that. And she's referencing a manuscript directly after talking about the revelatory experience she had when filming the All Too Well short film. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Taylor's film is going to be heavily inspired by the same relationship or perhaps relationships that inspired the song or songs that seem to be alluded to here. Write what you know, the professor told her. At any rate, the album ends with the line, "But the story isn't mine anymore." And it's been pointed out to me that the last two lines form a rhyme with an unspoken final line, which was included in Taylor's Instagram post announcing the album, which is, "It's yours." I think it's quite deliberate and nice that Taylor left that out. Saying it's yours to the fans on Instagram is a cool gesture, but I think from Taylor's perspective, as the person making this art and writing this album, the importance is really that it's not hers anymore. To quote Taylor herself, "This writer is of the firm belief that our tears become wholly in the form of ink on a page. Once we have spoken our saddest story, we can be free of it." Taylor very clearly perceives herself, whether by fate or by choice, whether as a curse or a gift, as a conduit above all else that transforms heartbreak and pain into words. And by sharing those words, by putting the story and the feelings out into the world, they're not her pain anymore. They're her stories. Pain owns us, but we own our stories. By giving away the words, Taylor reclaims her heart. It's a really beautiful perspective, one that she's more than earned, and one that I hope sincerely is true. I really, really hope that. So that's the Manuscript. It's a really touching and soft and important song on which to end the album, and I really love how sparse the instrumentation is except for that one swell around the bridge. It's room and space for Taylor to just say what she needs to say. And her vocal delivery of the final line is just the cherry on top of the whole record. In Taylor's early career, it was a fairly common critique of mine that I felt like she often ended the albums with underwhelming songs, but these last few records have ended so perfectly, and both of this album's final two songs feel like the most important personal messages from Taylor on the record, and they're both just really heartfelt and somber in a way that suits the overall tone of the album. So those are my thoughts on the Tortured Poets department. There's not too much to say that I haven't already covered somewhere in the 27,000 words that made up the intro and song reviews here, except this. I'm extremely grateful to Taylor for releasing so much music with so much honesty and vulnerability, and so many creative choices that I'm sure she was aware would be met with mixed reception. Because it would have been all too easy to trim this down into a more manageable size, to discard the most creatively challenging bits, to make this far more palatable and accessible for someone who's going to review it 6 hours after it releases, or someone who's reviewing Grammy nominees. She could have done that, and no one would have blamed her for it. But instead, she released this whole monumental, tumultuous, complex masterpiece of an album as it is, and let us in on a depth and a dimension of her work that's deeper and more intricate than anything on any of her previous records. And I'm just grateful for that, because this music already means a lot to me, and it's going to continue to mean a lot to me, very probably for the rest of my life. And not that many people have given me something like that. So, thank you, Taylor.